Some nights, the dead don't stay where you put them. I'm Marcus, and I've worked night security at Peaceful Rest Funeral Home for 6 years now. It's not glamorous work, but it pays decent, and the hours suit me fine. Most people think watching over the dead would be creepy, but honestly, it's the living you have to worry about. Grieving families sometimes try to break in for one last goodbye, or vandals looking to cause trouble. The dead? They've never given me any problems. Until this past spring, my shift runs from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., Tuesday through Saturday. The funeral home sits on 12 acres of rolling hills, with the main building housing our chapels, viewing rooms, and preparation areas. The cemetery spreads out behind us like a small city of granite and marble. I make rounds every 2 hours, checking locks, testing alarms, and making sure everything's secure. The building has motion sensors throughout, connected to cameras that record everything. It's a good system, catches the occasional raccoon or stray cat that wanders in through an open door. The sensors are sensitive, picking up movement as small as a bird landing on a windowsill. After 6 years, I know every normal trigger. The way shadows move across viewing room windows when headlights pass on the street, how the heating system causes certain doors to settle and creak. But viewing room B started acting up in late March. Every Tuesday morning when I'd review the overnight footage, I'd see the motion sensor had triggered at exactly 3:17 a.m. Always the same time, always the same room. But when I'd check the camera feed, I'd see nothing but the empty display casket we keep set up for families to examine our craftsmanship. Just an empty room with soft lighting and flower arrangements. At first, I figured it was a malfunction. Maybe a mouse had made a nest somewhere the camera couldn't see, or the sensor was picking up vibrations from the heating system. I made notes in my report, suggesting maintenance take a look during business hours. The triggers kept happening. Every Tuesday, 3:17 a.m. sharp. I started paying closer attention during my rounds, lingering near viewing room B around that time. The first few weeks, I'd seen nothing unusual. The room would be exactly as we'd left it. Chairs arranged in neat rows, the display casket positioned at the front, silk flowers arranged just so. But something felt different. Not wrong, exactly, but different, like the air itself was holding its breath. On the 4th Tuesday in April, I decided to position myself where I could watch the room directly when the sensor triggered. I settled into a chair in the hallway with a clear view through the glass doors. At 3:16 a.m., I checked my watch and waited. At exactly 3:17, the motion sensor chirped softly, indicating activation. I looked into the room and froze. An elderly woman stood beside the display casket, her back to me. She wore a floral dress, soft pink roses on a cream background, and her silver hair was styled in the kind of careful waves that spoke of a weekly appointment at the beauty shop. Her hands rested gently on the casket's edge, and she stood perfectly still, as if paying her respects. I blinked hard, certain I was seeing things. When I looked again, the room was empty. My heart hammered as I fumbled for my keys and unlocked the viewing room door. The space was exactly as it should be. No sign anyone had been there. No lingering perfume. No disturbed dust. Nothing. But the temperature felt different, cooler somehow, like someone had opened a window on a winter night. I checked the camera footage immediately. The timestamp showed the motion sensor triggering at 3:17 a.m., just like always. But the video showed only an empty room. That's when I started paying attention to details I'd overlooked before. I pulled up our burial records and cross-referenced them with the motion sensor logs. The triggers had started on March 21st, exactly 1 year after we'd buried Mrs. Eleanor Vance in Plot 47. Her family had specifically requested she be buried in her favorite dress, pink roses on cream, the one she'd worn to her granddaughter's wedding. The next Tuesday, I was ready. I positioned myself in the same chair at 3:15 a.m., camera ready on my phone. I wanted proof of what I was seeing, something I could show my supervisor that wouldn't make me sound like I was losing my mind. 3:17 a.m. came and went. The sensor triggered, just like always. And there she was again, Mrs. Eleanor Vance, standing beside the display casket in her floral dress. This time, I managed to snap a photo before she vanished. The photo showed an empty room. I started researching Mrs. Vance, reading through her obituary and service records. She'd been a regular volunteer at the funeral home for 23 years, helping families choose flowers and arrange services. She'd practically lived in viewing room B during her volunteer shifts, greeting mourners and offering comfort to the grieving. The room had been her domain, and she'd taken pride in making sure every detail was perfect for the families we served. The visits continued every Tuesday, always at the same time, always in the same room. I stopped trying to photograph her or prove what I was seeing. Instead, I found myself looking forward to her appearances. There was something comforting about her presence, like she was still taking care of the place she'd loved. But last Tuesday changed everything. I was in position at 3:15 a.m. when I heard something I'd never heard before. Soft footsteps in the hallway behind me. I turned and saw Mrs. Vance walking toward viewing room B, her floral dress rustling softly with each step. She moved with the careful dignity of someone who'd spent decades greeting grieving families, her face kind but serious. She stopped directly in front of me, and for the first time, we made eye contact. Her eyes were the pale blue of winter sky, and they held a sadness that went deeper than grief. She looked at me with the expression of someone who had something important to say, but couldn't find the words. Then she smiled, the same gentle smile she'd probably given to thousands of mourners over the years, and spoke in a voice like autumn leaves. "Thank you for letting me stay," she whispered. Then she walked into viewing room B and took her usual place beside the display casket. The motion sensor triggered at exactly 3:17 a.m., and she faded away like morning mist. I sit here now, writing this report as my shift ends and dawn breaks over the cemetery. I don't know if anyone will believe what I've experienced, and I'm not even sure it matters. Mrs. Eleanor Vance spent 23 years taking care of this place and the families who needed comfort in their darkest moments. Maybe some kinds of love are stronger than death. Maybe some people care so deeply about a place that they can't bear to leave it, even when they're supposed to. All I know is that next Tuesday, I'll be in that chair at 3:15 a.m., keeping watch with a woman who refuses to let death stop her from doing the job she loved. Some nights, the dead don't stay where you put them, and sometimes, that's exactly how it should be. The flowers always know when something's wrong. I'm Elena, and I've been arranging funeral flowers at Serenity Memorial for 8 years now. It's delicate work, creating beauty in the midst of grief, and I take pride in getting every detail right. Flowers are a language unto themselves. White lilies for peace, red roses for love, baby's breath for eternal devotion. Each arrangement tells a story about the person being honored and the family left behind. But some flowers refuse to follow the rules. My workroom sits adjacent to the main preparation area, where our embalmers and cosmetologists prepare the deceased for their final viewing. Large windows allow natural light to flood the space, essential for color matching and ensuring arrangements look their best under the chapel's soft lighting. I keep my workspace meticulously organized, flower food precisely measured, stems cut at perfect angles, every tool cleaned and positioned exactly where it needs to be. The work requires intuition as much as technique. After 8 years, I can sense when something's off about a particular arrangement or service. Maybe it's the way certain flowers wilt too quickly, or how some arrangements seem to shift position overnight. Small details that most people would dismiss, but in this business, you learn to pay attention to the subtle signs. Mrs. Chen's service was scheduled for a Thursday morning in early May. Her family had requested white lilies, dozens of them, arranged in cascading sprays around her casket. It was a beautiful choice. White lilies symbolized the restored innocence of the soul after death, and Mrs. Chen had been a kindergarten teacher for 40 years. The symbolism felt appropriate. I spent Tuesday afternoon creating the arrangements, using the finest blooms I could source. The lilies were perfect. Petals like ivory silk, stamens heavy with pollen, that clean, sweet fragrance that makes you think of Easter mornings and new beginnings. I arranged them with delicate ferns and white baby's breath, creating the kind of display that would bring comfort to the family while honoring Mrs. Chen's gentle nature. When I finished, the arrangements were flawless. I placed them in the refrigeration unit overnight to keep them fresh for the viewing, following our standard procedures. Everything looked exactly as it should. Wednesday morning changed everything. I arrived at 7 a.m. to put the finishing touches on Mrs. Chen's flowers before the family's private viewing at 9. When I opened the refrigeration unit, I stopped cold. The white lilies had begun wilting in a pattern I'd never seen before. Not the usual browning at petal edges or drooping stems, but a perfect spiral, starting from the center of each bloom and working outward. One petal at a time, starting with the innermost ones, had turned a soft, gray-brown and curled inward. The pattern was identical on every lily in every arrangement, as if someone had taken a tiny brush and painted decay in precise spirals. But the outer petals remained pristine white, and the stems showed no signs of deterioration. I'd been working with flowers for years and had never seen wilting follow such a specific pattern. Flowers usually die from the outside in, starting with the most exposed petals and working toward the protected center. This was the complete opposite of natural decay. I quickly prepared fresh arrangements, working faster than I'd ever worked before. The family would arrive in 2 hours, and I couldn't let them see their mother's flowers in that condition. But as I worked, I noticed something that made my hands shake. The original arrangements seemed to be breathing. It was subtle at first, just the faintest movement in the blooms, like they were expanding and contracting with an impossible rhythm. I told myself it was just the air circulation system, that the movement was caused by gentle currents from the ventilation. But when I leaned closer to adjust one of the sprays, I could swear I felt warm breath against my cheek. That's when I heard it. The whisper came from somewhere within the flowers themselves, so quiet I almost missed it. 3 words, repeated over and over in a voice like rustling leaves. "Tell them I'm still here." I stepped back so quickly I knocked over my water bucket, sending tools scattering across the floor. The sound echoed through the workroom like thunder, and when I looked back at the arrangements, they were completely still. Just flowers doing what flowers do, slowly dying, the way flowers are supposed to. But the spiral pattern continued spreading throughout that day. I replaced the arrangements 3 times before the family arrived, but each fresh set of lilies developed the same impossible decay within hours. Perfect spirals working from center to edge, each petal curling inward, as if protecting something hidden at the heart of each bloom. And always that subtle movement, like breathing, accompanied by whispers too soft to understand clearly. The family arrived for their private viewing, and I watched nervously as they entered the chapel. Mrs. Chen looked peaceful in her casket, surrounded by the 4th set of lily arrangements I'd created that day. These flowers remained perfect throughout the viewing, as if they understood the importance of the moment. But I stayed close, listening. During the service, Mrs. Chen's daughter Sarah spoke about her mother's dedication to her students, how she'd often say that a teacher's job didn't end with the school day. She believed her influence lived on in every child she taught, Sarah said through tears. She used to tell us, "I'm always there with them, even when they can't see me." As Sarah spoke those words, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the chapel's air conditioning. The flowers around Mrs. Chen's casket began that subtle breathing motion again, barely visible unless you knew to look for it. And in the moment of silence that followed Sarah's words, I heard the whisper again, clearer this time. "Tell them I'm still here." The voice was unmistakably that of an elderly woman, gentle but insistent. It seemed to come from the flowers themselves, as if Mrs. Chen's essence had somehow settled into the white lilies and was trying to communicate through them. After the service ended and the family left for the burial, I remained in the chapel with the arrangements. The breathing motion had become more pronounced, and the whispers came more frequently now. Not just, "Tell them I'm still here," but other phrases. "Watch over the children. Don't let them forget. The garden needs tending." I realized these weren't random words. They were the things Mrs. Chen would have said if she could speak to her family one more time. The flowers had become her voice, carrying messages she desperately needed to share. That evening, I did something I'd never done before. I took one of the lily arrangements home and placed it on my kitchen table. Throughout the night, I listened as Mrs. Chen's voice whispered through the flowers, sharing memories of students she'd taught, concerns about family members, and instructions for tending her beloved garden. By morning, the lilies had completed their spiral decay. Every petal curled inward around the hidden center. But they didn't smell of death or decomposition. Instead, they carried the faint scent of chalk dust and apple slices, the smell of an elementary school classroom. I returned to work that day with a new understanding of what flowers can do. They don't just honor the dead with their beauty. Sometimes they carry their voices, their final messages, their refusal to let go of the people and places they loved most. Now, whenever I create arrangements for a service, I pay closer attention to what the flowers are trying to tell me. Most of the time, they're just flowers, doing what flowers do. But sometimes, just sometimes, they become something more. Mrs. Chen's garden, according to her daughter, bloomed more beautifully that spring than it ever had before. The white lilies she'd planted years earlier grew in perfect spirals, each bloom opening from the center outward, as if following a pattern they'd learned from somewhere else. Some forms of love are too strong to be contained by death. Sometimes they find ways to keep blooming, to keep whispering, to keep reminding us that beauty and care can transcend even the deepest loss. The flowers always know when something's wrong, but they also know when something's exactly right. The earth remembers what we try to forget. I'm Tom, and I've been groundskeeper at Hillcrest Cemetery for 12 years now. It's honest work, maintaining the final resting place of our community, making sure the grounds stay beautiful for the families who visit. Every morning, I walk these acres with my tools and my routine, checking on sprinkler systems, trimming overgrown grass around headstones, and making sure everything looks respectful and well cared for. But some mornings, the cemetery shows me things I'd rather not see. Hillcrest spans 37 acres of rolling hills, divided into sections that date back to 1894. The older sections near the entrance have elaborate Victorian monuments and family mausoleums, while the newer areas favor simple flat markers that are easier to maintain. I know every section, every path, every quirk of the grounds. After 12 years, you develop an intimate relationship with a place like this. My daily routine starts at dawn. I check the maintenance shed, load my truck with whatever tools I'll need, and begin systematically working through my assigned areas. Mondays and Wednesdays are for mowing, Tuesdays and Thursdays for detail work around monuments, and Fridays for general maintenance and preparation for weekend services. It's predictable work, which suits me fine. In a place where everything is about final endings, it's comforting to have routines you can depend on. The metal detector is part of my standard equipment, useful for locating property markers, finding lost jewelry dropped by visitors, and occasionally discovering old irrigation lines that aren't marked on the cemetery maps. It's a practical tool in a business where precise boundaries matter, and where families sometimes bury personal items that interfere with maintenance equipment. Section C is one of the newer areas, developed in the 1970s when the cemetery expanded beyond its original boundaries. The plots are laid out in neat geometric patterns, with uniform spacing and consistent landscaping. It's efficient and orderly, though it lacks the character of the older sections. Most of the headstones are simple granite markers with basic inscriptions, names, dates, maybe a short phrase about beloved husbands or cherished mothers. Plot 142 sits in the middle of Section C, occupied by Harold Martinez, who died in 1996 at the age of 73. His marker is standard gray granite with block lettering. Harold Martinez. Beloved Father. 1,923 1,996. Nothing unusual about it. Nothing that would draw special attention. Just another resting place in a field of resting places. But the ground around plot 142 started acting strange last December. It began with my metal detector giving inconsistent readings in that area. I'd be sweeping for irrigation markers or checking for metal debris, and the detector would beep frantically over a section of ground about 6 feet east of Harold's marker. But when I'd dig down, I'd find nothing but dirt and the occasional root from the oak tree that shades that corner of Section C. The readings became more frequent and more intense as winter progressed. By January, the detector would start screaming as soon as I got within 10 feet of that unmarked spot. Not the steady beep of buried metal, but an urgent, chaotic alarm that suggested something substantial buried beneath the surface. I mentioned it to the cemetery director, Mrs. Foster, during our weekly maintenance meeting. She pulled out the official plot maps and burial records, tracing her finger along the neat lines that showed exactly what was buried where. According to the records, nothing should be in the ground east of plot 142 except the natural earth and whatever root systems had developed over the years. But the metal detector insisted otherwise. Mrs. Foster authorized me to do some exploratory digging, just enough to determine if there was old irrigation equipment or forgotten maintenance materials buried in that spot. I started digging on a Tuesday morning in late January, working carefully with a hand shovel to avoid damaging anything important. 3 feet down, my shovel hit something solid. It wasn't metal. That much was immediately clear. The sound was wrong, more like hitting wood that had been underground long enough to become dense and waterlogged. I dug more carefully, brushing soil away with my hands, and gradually uncovered the corner of what appeared to be a small wooden casket, a child's casket. I stopped digging immediately and called Mrs. Foster. She arrived within an hour, bringing the cemetery's original surveyor maps and a stack of burial records dating back to the 1970s when Section C was first developed. We spent the rest of the morning going through every document, looking for any record of a child buried in that location. Nothing. According to every official record we had, no child had ever been interred anywhere near plot 142. Mrs. Foster authorized a full excavation, bringing in proper equipment and following all the protocols for handling unmarked graves. What we found, 3.5 feet down, was a simple pine casket, child-sized, with no nameplate or identifying markers. The wood was weathered but intact, preserved by the clay soil that dominated that section of the cemetery. The county coroner was called in, along with a representative from the State Historic Preservation Office. They documented everything meticulously: measurements, photographs, soil samples. The casket was removed with the kind of reverence reserved for sacred things, even when those things aren't supposed to exist. Inside, they found the remains of a child approximately 6 years old, along with a few personal items: a small wooden toy horse, a child's prayer book, and a locket containing 2 photographs, too deteriorated to identify clearly. But there was no identification, no records, no explanation for how or when this child came to be buried in an unmarked grave in the middle of Section C. The coroner estimated the burial had taken place sometime in the 1960s or early 70s, before Section C was officially developed. Someone had buried this child in what was then an empty field, maybe hoping the grave would remain undisturbed. When the cemetery expanded and plot 142 was established directly adjacent to the unmarked burial, the secret had been preserved by pure chance. But the strangest part came the morning after the excavation. I arrived at dawn to find fresh dandelions arranged in a perfect circle around the spot where we'd found the casket. Not growing from the ground, placed there deliberately, their stems cut clean, and their bright yellow heads arranged with the kind of precision that suggested careful, loving hands. Dandelions in January. In Michigan, when the ground was frozen solid, and snow covered everything for miles around. The flowers appeared every morning for the next 2 weeks. Always the same arrangement. A perfect circle of fresh dandelions, their stems cut to identical lengths, positioned exactly where the child's casket had been buried. I would remove them each day during my maintenance rounds, but they would reappear by the following morning, as fresh and bright as if they'd been picked from a spring meadow. I started arriving earlier, hoping to catch whoever was leaving the flowers. By 6 a.m., I was parked at the cemetery entrance with a clear view of Section C, but I never saw anyone approach the area. The flowers would simply be there when dawn broke, arranged with the same careful precision as if they'd grown overnight in their perfect circle. On Valentine's Day, I found something different among the dandelions. A small wooden toy horse, identical to the one that had been buried with the child. I'd been at the excavation when the coroner removed that horse from the casket, and I'd seen it tagged and bagged as evidence. But here was its twin, placed carefully in the center of the dandelion circle, like an offering. That's when I started paying attention to other details I'd been overlooking. The oak tree that shades plot 142 had developed an unusual growth pattern over the winter. Its lower branches had begun growing in a distinctly circular formation, creating a natural canopy directly over the spot where we'd found the child. The grass in that area stayed green despite the harsh winter weather, forming a perfect circle that matched the dandelion arrangements exactly. And sometimes, early in the morning when the mist was thick and the light was soft, I could swear I heard something that sounded like a child's laughter carried on the wind. Mrs. Foster arranged for the child's remains to be properly interred in the cemetery's memorial garden, with a small marker that read simply, "Unknown child, remembered and loved." It seemed like the right thing to do, giving this forgotten soul the dignity of a recognized resting place. But the dandelions kept appearing in their circle around plot 142. Even now, in early May, they continue to show up every morning. Not the wild, random growth of dandelions taking over a lawn, but that same careful arrangement of cut stems and bright yellow heads, positioned with the precision of someone who understands the importance of remembering the forgotten. I don't remove them anymore. Instead, I maintain the circle, making sure the grass around it stays trimmed and the area remains neat and respectful. It's become part of my routine, tending this unofficial memorial to a child whose name we'll never know, but whose presence refuses to be erased. The earth remembers what we try to forget. Sometimes it reminds us in ways that make us question everything we think we know about death and memory and the persistence of love. Plot 142 officially belongs to Harold Martinez, but it will always be shared with a nameless child whose grave was marked only by dandelions and the mysterious devotion of someone who refused to let them be forgotten completely. Some secrets are meant to stay buried. Others are meant to bloom again and again, reminding us that every life, no matter how brief or forgotten, deserves to be remembered and honored. The dandelions know this. They keep teaching me, one perfect circle at a time. The dead sometimes have unfinished business with the living. I'm Jude, and I've been head embalmer at Riverside Memorial for 15 years. It's technical work that requires steady hands, scientific knowledge, and a deep respect for the people entrusted to your care. Each body tells a story, not just how they died, but how they lived, what they valued, how they were loved. My job is to help them tell that story one final time, preparing them for their family's last goodbye. But some stories refuse to end when the embalming is complete. The preparation room is my domain, a sterile, well-lit space equipped with everything necessary to restore dignity to death. Stainless steel tables, precision instruments, chemical solutions mixed according to exact formulas developed over decades of practice. Everything has its place. Every procedure follows established protocols. After 15 years, the work has become a meditation, a series of careful steps that transform the clinical reality of death into something families can bear to witness. The attached storage cooler maintains a constant 38 degrees, necessary for preserving bodies before and after preparation. It's divided into 12 compartments, each one climate-controlled and monitored by digital systems that alert me to any temperature fluctuations. The cooler operates silently, just a subtle hum of machinery that becomes part of the background silence I've grown accustomed to. Mr. Rodriguez came to us on a Tuesday afternoon in March. 74 years old, survived by 3 children and 7 grandchildren. He died peacefully at home after a long battle with emphysema, surrounded by family who'd taken shifts caring for him through his final months. His daughter Maria had sung lullabies to him during his last hours, the same songs he'd sung to her when she was small, keeping alive the gentle rhythms that had defined their relationship. The family requested a traditional viewing followed by burial at the Catholic cemetery across town. They wanted Mr. Rodriguez to look peaceful, like he was simply sleeping, so his grandchildren could say goodbye without being frightened. It was the kind of request I received regularly, the kind of work that made the technical aspects of my job feel like a sacred calling. I began preparing Mr. Rodriguez on Wednesday morning, following my established routine. The process requires several hours and complete attention to detail. Arterial injection, cavity treatment, cosmetic restoration. Each step must be performed with precision and respect, understanding that the families who would see the results were trusting me with their most precious memories. But as I worked, I began noticing sounds from the storage cooler that I'd never heard before. It started as a soft humming, so quiet I initially dismissed it as equipment noise, maybe a slight variation in the compressor cycle or air circulation system. But as the morning progressed, the humming became more distinct, more melodic. It wasn't mechanical noise, it was a song, a lullaby to be specific. The same gentle melody that Maria Rodriguez had mentioned during our arrangement conference, the one she'd sung to comfort her father during his final days. I paused my work and listened more carefully. The melody was coming from inside the storage cooler, drifting through the sealed compartments like a whispered memory. It was definitely a human voice, feminine, elderly, with the slight tremor that comes with advanced age. But all the bodies currently in storage had been there for days, and none of them were elderly women. I checked the cooler's temperature monitors and ventilation systems. Everything registered normal. No mechanical issues that would explain the sound. The humming continued, soft but persistent, the same lullaby repeated over and over, with the patience of someone soothing a restless child. When I resumed my work on Mr. Rodriguez, the humming grew slightly louder, as if responding to my proximity to his body. The melody was hauntingly beautiful, filled with the kind of love that transcends mortality. It was the sound of someone who'd spent decades singing children to sleep, whose voice carried the accumulated tenderness of countless bedtime routines. By noon, I'd completed the arterial preparation and moved on to cosmetic restoration. This is delicate work, requiring an artist's eye combined with technical precision. The goal is to recreate the appearance of peaceful sleep, to give families a final image that will comfort rather than disturb. I'd been working on Mr. Rodriguez's facial features for about 30 minutes when I noticed something that stopped me cold. His expression had changed. When I'd begun the preparation that morning, his face had worn the neutral expression typical of recent death. Features relaxed, muscles slack, the kind of blank peacefulness that comes when all struggle has ended. But now, as I worked to restore his natural appearance, I could see the faintest suggestion of a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. In 15 years of embalming, I'd never seen facial features shift after arterial injection. The chemical process that preserves tissue also fixes it in place, preventing the kind of muscular changes that would alter expression. What I was seeing shouldn't be physically possible. But there it was, a subtle but unmistakable smile, the kind that comes from hearing something that brings deep contentment. The humming from the storage cooler continued throughout the afternoon, sometimes so soft I had to strain to hear it, other times clear enough that I could make out individual notes of the melody. It was definitely the lullaby Maria had described, the song that had provided comfort during Mr. Rodriguez's final hours. As I completed the cosmetic work and prepared to move Mr. Rodriguez to his casket, the humming reached its clearest point yet. For just a moment, I could make out words beneath the melody, Spanish phrases sung with the loving patience of a grandmother helping a child find peaceful sleep. That's when I realized what I was hearing. The voice belonged to Mrs. Rodriguez, Mr. Rodriguez's wife of 52 years, who had died 3 years earlier from complications of diabetes. Maria had mentioned during our arrangement conference that her mother had been the family's singer, the one who'd taught all the children and grandchildren the lullabies that had been passed down through generations. Mrs. Rodriguez was still singing to her husband, helping him find peace in death, just as she'd helped him find peace in life. I stood in the preparation room listening to a dead woman's voice comfort her deceased husband, and instead of feeling frightened, I felt privileged to witness such profound love. The humming continued as I transferred Mr. Rodriguez to his casket, growing softer as we moved away from the storage cooler, but never disappearing entirely. The family viewing was scheduled for Thursday evening. I positioned Mr. Rodriguez carefully in his casket, ensuring his suit was perfectly arranged, and his peaceful expression, now featuring that subtle smile, looked natural and comforting. The viewing room was filled with flowers, photographs, and 3 generations of family members who'd come to say goodbye. During the service, Maria stood beside her father's casket and began singing the same lullaby I'd heard in the preparation room. Her voice was clear and strong, carrying the melody that had provided comfort through decades of bedtimes and difficult nights. As she sang, other family members joined in, creating a chorus of voices that filled the chapel with the kind of love that makes death feel less final. But underneath their living voices, I could still hear that other voice, Mrs. Rodriguez, singing along from wherever she waited for her husband to join her. After the family left, and I was preparing to seal the casket for burial, I heard the humming one last time. It was different now, not the soothing repetition of a lullaby, but a more complex melody that seemed to be moving away, growing fainter with each note. It was the sound of someone who'd completed an important task and could finally rest. Mr. Rodriguez's smile remained peaceful and content as I closed his casket for the final time. I never heard Mrs. Rodriguez's voice again after that night, though I've prepared dozens of bodies in the months since. The storage cooler operates with its normal mechanical silence, and my work proceeds according to established routines. But sometimes, when I'm working with someone who died surrounded by family love, I find myself listening more carefully to the silence, wondering if other voices might be waiting just beyond the range of normal hearing. Death doesn't always end our capacity to care for the people we love most. Sometimes it simply changes the methods we use to provide comfort, transforming lullabies into echoes that carry across the boundary between life and whatever comes after. The dead sometimes have unfinished business with the living, but sometimes that business is simply making sure their loved ones know they're not alone, that the songs that mattered in life continue to matter in death. Mrs. Rodriguez kept singing until she was certain her husband could hear her voice guiding him home. Some people refuse to let death have the final word. I'm Sarah Chen, and I've been funeral director at Evergreen Memorial for 7 years. My job involves coordinating the countless details that transform grief into ceremony, scheduling services, guiding families through difficult decisions, ensuring that final farewells happen with dignity and grace. You develop a sensitivity to people's needs in this work, learning to recognize the different ways grief expresses itself and how to provide appropriate support. But some mourners carry grief that goes beyond normal human experience. Evergreen Memorial serves families from across 3 counties, hosting everything from small, intimate services to large celebrations of life. Our main chapel seats 200 people, with additional viewing rooms for private family gatherings. The building dates back to 1923, with modern updates that maintain the classical architecture while providing contemporary amenities. High ceilings, beautiful stained glass, and acoustic design that allows every spoken word to reach the back row with clarity. During busy periods, we might host 4 or 5 services per day, each one requiring careful coordination of flowers, music, seating arrangements, and the dozen other details that help families focus on saying goodbye rather than logistics. You learn to move between services efficiently, providing each family with complete attention while managing the complex schedule that keeps everything running smoothly. That's how I first noticed her, the woman who seemed to attend every service. It started in early February, during what we call the winter rush, the period when families who delayed services during the holidays finally scheduled their farewells. We were hosting multiple services daily, and I was moving between chapels, checking on families, and coordinating with our staff to ensure everything proceeded without problem. The woman appeared during Mrs. Patterson's service on a Tuesday afternoon. She sat in the back row of the main chapel, wearing a navy coat that looked expensive but not new, her gray hair styled in a neat bun that spoke of weekly salon appointments. Her hands rested folded in her lap, and she maintained the respectful posture of someone who understood funeral etiquette perfectly. I didn't think much of it initially. Sometimes community members attend services for people they knew only slightly, or longtime residents come to pay respects to families they'd known for decades. In a small town, funeral services often draw people whose connection to the deceased might not be immediately obvious to the family. But she was there again on Thursday for Mr. Jennings' service. Same navy coat, same neat hair, same respectful posture in the back row. This time I paid closer attention, wondering if she might be a distant relative or family friend who'd known both deceased individuals. But during the receiving line after the service, she didn't approach the family or sign the guest book. She simply sat quietly through the entire ceremony, then left without speaking to anyone. By the third service, Mrs. Morrison's celebration of life the following Monday, I was actively watching for her. Sure enough, she appeared just before the service began, taking her usual place in the back row. Her presence was almost ghostly in its consistency, like she was part of the chapel's permanent fixtures rather than a mourner with personal connections to the deceased. I began keeping informal notes about her appearances. Every service we hosted over the next 6 weeks, she attended. Memorial services, traditional funerals, celebrations of life. It didn't matter the format or the family involved. She would arrive quietly, sit in the back row, and observe the entire ceremony with the same respectful attention. Her behavior wasn't disruptive or inappropriate. She dressed properly, maintained silence during services, and never did anything that would draw attention or disturb grieving families. But her constant presence began to feel unsettling, in a way I couldn't quite articulate. There was something about her stillness, her consistency, that seemed to exist outside normal human patterns. During the 4th week of March, I decided to approach her directly. The Hendricks family was holding a service for their teenage son who died in a car accident, and the chapel was filled with young people struggling to comprehend loss that felt impossibly unfair. The woman in the navy coat sat in her usual place, watching the proceedings with the same careful attention she'd shown at every other service. After the family left for the burial, I walked over to her pew. She remained seated, hands folded, looking toward the front of the chapel, where moments before a 17-year-old boy's casket had been surrounded by flowers and photographs of a life cut short. "Excuse me," I said softly. "I'm Sarah Chen, the funeral director here. I've noticed you've been attending our services, and I wanted to make sure you're finding what you need." She turned to look at me then, and I felt something cold settle in my stomach. Her face was kind, but impossibly old. Not just elderly, but ancient in a way that seemed to stretch back through decades I couldn't calculate. Her eyes held depths that made me think of photographs from the Civil War, daguerreotypes of women who'd lived through losses that predated modern grief counseling and support systems. "I'm just making sure they stay down," she said in a voice like autumn leaves scraping across pavement. The words hit me like cold water. Not, "I'm paying my respects," or "I knew them from church," or any of the normal explanations I'd been expecting. Just that chilling phrase, delivered with matter-of-fact certainty that made my skin crawl. "I'm sorry, what do you mean by that?" I asked. But she was already standing, moving toward the aisle with the careful steps of someone whose bones carried weight I couldn't comprehend. She walked toward the chapel's side exit, the one that leads directly to the cemetery grounds. I followed her, wanting answers to questions I was only beginning to formulate. But when I reached the door and looked out into the late afternoon shadows, she was nowhere to be seen. The cemetery grounds stretch for 12 acres behind our building, filled with monuments dating back to the 1800s. There are dozens of paths, clusters of trees, and mausoleums that could provide cover for someone who wanted to disappear quickly. But the woman in the navy coat had vanished as completely as if she'd never existed. That night, I pulled our guest books from recent services, looking for any signature that might identify her. I found nothing. Despite attending dozens of services over 2 months, she'd never signed a single book or left any record of her presence beyond my own observations. I started asking our staff if they'd noticed her. Marcus, our night security guard, said he'd never seen anyone matching her description during his shifts. Elena, who arranged flowers for every service, couldn't recall seeing her either. It was as if she existed only for me, visible during ceremonies, but invisible to everyone else who worked in the building. The following week brought the Jennings burial service, a graveside ceremony for the family patriarch who'd requested to be interred beside his wife of 60 years. It was a small gathering, just immediate family and a few close friends. The kind of intimate service that feels more like a private conversation than a public ceremony. The woman in the navy coat stood at the edge of the cemetery, partially hidden behind a large oak tree that had probably been growing there since before the first graves were dug. She wasn't close enough to hear the pastor's words or intrude on the family's privacy, but her presence felt significant in a way that made me deeply uncomfortable. After the family departed and our staff finished their duties, I walked over to where she'd been standing. The ground beneath the oak tree showed no footprints, despite the soft earth left by recent rain. But carved into the tree's bark, so old the letters were nearly grown over, I found an inscription. Eleanor Blackwood, 1847, 1923, Keeper of the Dead. I researched Eleanor Blackwood when I returned to the office. Cemetery records from the early 1900s mentioned her briefly. She'd been a local woman who'd appointed herself unofficial guardian of the burial grounds, spending her final years ensuring proper maintenance and respect for the deceased. She died at age 76 and was buried in an unmarked grave somewhere in the oldest section of the cemetery. The dates didn't make sense, though. If Eleanor Blackwood died in 1923, she couldn't be the woman I'd been seeing at services. But the physical description in the old records matched perfectly. Gray hair, worn in a neat bun, always dressed in her best navy coat, known for her respectful demeanor and her fierce dedication to ensuring the dead remained undisturbed. I continued seeing her at every service through the rest of March and into April. Always the same position, always the same respectful attention, always that unsettling sense that she was monitoring something beyond normal human concern. But now I understood what she'd meant when she said she was making sure they stayed down. Eleanor Blackwood, whether alive or dead, was keeping watch over the cemetery and everyone buried there. She attended every funeral to ensure the newly deceased were properly laid to rest, that the ceremonies were conducted with appropriate respect, and that nothing disturbed the eternal sleep of those entrusted to the ground. The realization should have been terrifying, but instead, I found it oddly comforting. In a profession where you're constantly reminded of death's finality, there was something reassuring about knowing someone was still standing guard, still ensuring that final rest remained truly final. My last direct encounter with her came during the Memorial Day weekend service, a community ceremony honoring all those buried in our cemetery. Hundreds of people gathered among the headstones, placing flowers and sharing memories of loved ones who died years or decades earlier. I saw her moving through the crowd, no longer confined to the back rows of chapel services. She walked among the graves with the familiarity of someone who knew every name, every story, every family represented in the cemetery. Occasionally, she would pause beside a headstone, adjust flowers that had been disturbed by wind, or simply stand in silent acknowledgement of someone she'd once known. Near the end of the ceremony, she approached me directly for the first time since that conversation in the chapel. "You do good work here," she said, her ancient eyes reflecting approval that felt more valuable than any professional recognition I'd ever received. "The families trust you, and the dead rest easy because of your care." "Thank you," I managed, though my voice came out smaller than I'd intended. Are you Eleanor Blackwood?" She smiled then, the first time I'd seen any expression other than solemn attention cross her features. It was a gentle smile, filled with the satisfaction of someone whose long work was finally being recognized. "I am," she said simply, "and you're the first person to ask my name in more years than I care to count. How long have you been watching over this place?" "Since the day I was buried here," she replied matter-of-factly. "Someone needs to make sure they stay down, that the living don't disturb what should remain at rest. Someone needs to witness every farewell, to ensure respect is paid and proper ceremonies are observed." She looked around the cemetery, taking in the dozens of families gathered among the headstones, the flowers placed with loving care, the children learning to honor grandparents they'd never met. "Death isn't the end of caring," she continued. "For some of us, it's just a change in how we show that care. You help families say goodbye with dignity. I help ensure those goodbyes are honored permanently." With that, she turned and walked deeper into the cemetery, moving between the headstones with the confident steps of someone walking through her own home. I watched until she disappeared behind the old mausoleum in Section A, then waited to see if she would emerge on the other side. She never did. I haven't seen Eleanor Blackwood since that Memorial Day conversation, though I've continued working at Evergreen Memorial and hosting dozens of services. Sometimes I catch myself looking for her during ceremonies, checking the back rows for that familiar navy coat and neat gray hair. But her vigil seems to have ended, at least in any way I can observe. Maybe she decided I could be trusted to maintain the standards she'd upheld for over a century. Maybe she finally felt comfortable letting someone else share the responsibility of ensuring the dead receive proper respect and permanent rest. Or maybe she's still there, watching from places I can't see, continuing her eternal rounds through the cemetery grounds where she spent more than 100 years, making sure they stay down. Some people refuse to let death have the final word. Eleanor Blackwood chose to let it be the first word of a much longer conversation about duty, respect, and the ongoing care we owe to those who finished their earthly journey. Her vigil taught me that funeral direction isn't just about helping families through their immediate grief. It's about participating in a sacred trust that extends far beyond any single ceremony. We're not just burying the dead, we're ensuring they remain honored, protected, and peacefully at rest for as long as human memory and human care persist. Eleanor Blackwood understood this responsibility and chose to carry it beyond her own death. In her own mysterious way, she was the most dedicated funeral professional I've ever encountered. Some people aren't ready to say goodbye, even when goodbye is all that's left. I'm Mike Torres, Assistant Funeral Director at Peaceful Valley Memorial, and I've been in this business for 9 years. My job involves the practical details that families don't want to think about during their grief, coordinating with cemeteries, managing logistics for services, and ensuring that everything runs smoothly from the moment we receive someone into our care until their final resting place is sealed and blessed. But some cases refuse to follow normal procedures, no matter how carefully you follow protocol. Peaceful Valley has been serving our community since 1952, and we pride ourselves on attention to detail and respect for tradition. Our preparation rooms are equipped with the latest preservation technology, Our chapels are maintained to the highest standards, and our staff follows procedures developed through decades of experience. When families trust us with their loved ones, they expect perfection, and we deliver it consistently. The building operates on systems that have been refined over years of use. Security cameras monitor every area. Climate controls maintain precise temperatures. And our casket storage operates with mechanical precision that ensures proper care for every detail of a service. After 9 years, I know the sound of every door latch, every lock mechanism, every piece of equipment that keeps our operation running smoothly. Mrs. Patricia Patterson came to us on a Monday evening in late April. She was 87 years old, a retired librarian who'd lived alone since her husband's death 12 years earlier. Her niece, Jennifer, was her only surviving family, and she'd driven up from 2 states away to handle the arrangements. It was a straightforward case. Natural death at home, no complications, a simple viewing followed by burial beside her husband at the county cemetery. Mrs. Patterson had been very specific about her final arrangements, leaving detailed instructions that Jennifer followed precisely. She wanted a closed casket service with a single spray of white roses, a brief eulogy focusing on her 43 years as head librarian, and burial in the blue dress she'd worn to her granddaughter's wedding. Simple, dignified, exactly the kind of service that honors a life well lived without unnecessary complications. We scheduled the viewing for Wednesday evening, with burial on Thursday morning. I coordinated the details while our preparation staff took care of Mrs. Patterson, according to her wishes. By Tuesday afternoon, everything was ready. She looked peaceful in her blue dress. The casket was positioned in our smaller chapel, and the white roses were arranged exactly as requested. That's when the problem started. I arrived Wednesday morning to find Mrs. Patterson's casket open. Not partially open, as if the lid had settled or shifted during the night. Completely open, the upper portion of the casket raised to the full viewing position, as if someone had deliberately prepared it for a wake. Mrs. Patterson lay exactly as our staff had positioned her, hands folded, dress arranged perfectly. But the casket that had been securely closed and locked the evening before was now ready for viewing. I checked with our night security and staff. No one had accessed the chapel after closing time on Tuesday. The security cameras showed no movement in the chapel during the overnight hours, just empty pews and the closed casket sitting beneath soft lighting. But somehow, between 10 p.m. Tuesday and 7 a.m. Wednesday, the casket had opened itself. I called our head funeral director, Mrs. Coleman, who arrived within 30 minutes to inspect the situation. Together, we examined the casket's locking mechanism, a precision system that requires deliberate pressure in 2 specific locations to release. The locks showed no signs of tampering or mechanical failure. They had simply disengaged sometime during the night, allowing the upper casket lid to rise into viewing position. Mrs. Coleman suggested that perhaps the locks hadn't been properly engaged when the staff closed the casket Tuesday evening. It was the most logical explanation, even though I'd personally checked the locks before leaving that night. We repositioned Mrs. Patterson, closed the casket, and double-checked that the mechanism was properly secure. Thursday morning, I found the casket open again. This time, I was certain the locks had been properly engaged because I'd tested them myself. I'd stayed late Wednesday evening specifically to ensure everything was secure, checking the mechanism multiple times before setting the building's security system. But when I arrived Thursday morning, Mrs. Patterson was once again positioned for viewing, lying peacefully in her blue dress as if waiting for visitors who would never come. The family viewing was scheduled for 11 a.m., just 2 hours away. I quickly closed the casket and called Mrs. Coleman, explaining the situation. She arrived with our head technician, who disassembled the locking mechanism piece by piece, looking for any defect that might explain the repeated failures. The mechanism was in perfect working order. Every spring, every latch, every contact point functioned exactly as designed. There was no mechanical explanation for why the casket kept opening during the night. Mrs. Coleman made the decision to proceed with the viewing as scheduled, but to station someone in the chapel overnight to observe what was happening. If the casket opened again, we'd have a witness to whatever was causing the problem. The family viewing went smoothly. Jennifer and a few of Mrs. Patterson's longtime friends gathered in the chapel to pay their respects. They spoke about her dedication to the library, her love of mystery novels, and her habit of leaving little notes in library books for future readers to discover. She'd been a woman who believed in connection, in leaving small gifts for strangers, in making sure people never felt completely alone. After the family left, I personally supervised the closing of the casket. I engaged the locks myself, testing them multiple times to ensure they were secure. Then I positioned myself in the back pew of the chapel, settling in for what I expected to be a long, uneventful night of observation. At exactly 2:17 a.m., I heard the soft mechanical sound of locks disengaging. I watched in complete silence as Mrs. Patterson's casket began to open slowly, the upper lid rising with the smooth precision of a mechanism operating exactly as designed. But no one was touching the casket. No one was operating the release mechanism. The locks had simply chosen to open, allowing the lid to rise until Mrs. Patterson was once again positioned for viewing. But this time, something was different about her position. When our staff had prepared her for burial, Mrs. Patterson's head had been positioned straight ahead, eyes closed, hands folded over her chest in the traditional pose of peaceful rest. But now, her head was turned slightly toward the chapel doors, as if she was looking toward the entrance, waiting for someone to arrive. Her eyes remained closed, and her expression stayed peaceful. But the position change was unmistakable. Someone, or something, had moved her head after the casket opened, positioning her to face the doorway through which mourners would normally enter. I sat in that pew until dawn, watching Mrs. Patterson's still form and wondering what she might be waiting for. The casket remained open through the rest of the night, and her position didn't change again. She simply lay there, turned toward the chapel entrance, as if expecting visitors who never came. Friday morning brought the burial service, and Mrs. Coleman decided we needed to address the situation directly. She contacted Jennifer and explained what had been happening, asking if there was anything about Mrs. Patterson's final wishes that we might not understand. Jennifer was quiet for a long moment before responding. Aunt Patricia always said she hated the idea of a closed casket service, she finally admitted. She wanted people to be able to see her one last time, to say goodbye properly. But I thought it would be too difficult for me, seeing her like that. I requested the closed casket against her wishes. The revelation changed everything. Mrs. Patterson hadn't been trying to escape or cause problems. She'd been trying to honor her own final wishes, opening the casket to allow for the viewing she'd wanted. She'd been waiting in that chapel, positioned to greet mourners, hoping someone would come to say goodbye. Jennifer made the decision to honor her aunt's original wishes. We reopened the casket for a brief viewing before the burial service, allowing the library staff and community members who'd known Mrs. Patterson to pay their final respects. The chapel filled with people who'd wanted to say goodbye but hadn't felt welcome at what they'd assumed was a private family service. As mourners filed past the casket, I noticed that Mrs. Patterson's expression seemed more peaceful than it had during our previous preparations. Her head remained positioned toward the chapel entrance, but now it made sense. She was greeting each person who came to honor her memory, fulfilling her role as hostess one final time. After the viewing, when we closed the casket for burial, the locks engaged smoothly and held firm. There were no more mysterious openings, no more nighttime repositioning. Mrs. Patterson had gotten what she'd wanted, the chance to say goodbye properly, to see the faces of people who'd remember her, to maintain the connections that had defined her life. The burial service proceeded without incident. Mrs. Patterson was laid to rest beside her husband in the county cemetery, and her casket remained securely closed as it was lowered into the ground. But before the service ended, Jennifer placed something on top of the casket. A small note, written in her own handwriting. "Thank you for teaching me that some wishes are too important to ignore," it read. "Rest well, Aunt Patricia. Your goodbye was perfect. I learned something important from Mrs. Patterson's case. Sometimes the dead have very specific ideas about how their farewells should be conducted, and sometimes they're willing to make their preferences known in ways that challenge our assumptions about death and finality. Funeral direction isn't just about following procedures and maintaining professional standards. It's about listening, really listening, to what the deceased and their families need, even when those needs express themselves in unexpected ways. Mrs. Patterson spent 3 nights opening her casket because she understood something we'd forgotten, saying, "Goodbye is for the living, but it's also for the dead." Both sides need the opportunity to see each other one last time, to exchange the kind of recognition that makes parting possible. Some people aren't ready to say goodbye until they're certain the goodbye has been properly given and received. Mrs. Patricia Patterson was one of those people, and she was willing to work from beyond death to ensure her farewell happened exactly as it should. The casket that wouldn't stay closed was simply a tool in the hands of someone who refused to leave without proper ceremony. In the end, she got exactly what she'd wanted: a chapel full of people who loved her, the chance to greet each one as they said goodbye, and the peaceful rest that comes from knowing all connections have been properly honored. Sometimes the dead have conversations we're not meant to overhear. I'm Carlos, and I've been driving transport for Riverside Memorial Services for 11 years. My job is straightforward: pick up the deceased from hospitals, homes, or other locations, and transport them safely to our facility for preparation. It's quiet work that requires respect, discretion, and attention to the practical details that help families through their worst days. But some transports carry more than just the departed. The hearse I drive is a 2018 Cadillac XTS, equipped with everything necessary for dignified transport. Climate control maintains appropriate temperature. The GPS system ensures efficient routing, and the vehicle's design prioritizes both respect and functionality. After 11 years of this work, I know every road in 3 counties, every hospital loading dock, and every family home where I've provided this final service. The GPS system is standard equipment designed to record mileage and routing for our business records. It operates automatically, logging start times, destinations, and total distance for each transport. The system also includes audio recording capability, originally intended to document any incidents or unusual circumstances that might arise during transport. In 11 years, I'd never had reason to review those recordings until Mr. Hoffman's final journey. Mr. Theodore Hoffman was 91 years old when he passed away at Mercy General Hospital after a long battle with throat cancer. The disease had taken his voice 5 years earlier, leaving him unable to speak during his final years. His daughter Annie had moved back home to care for him, and she'd been at his bedside when he died peacefully on a Tuesday morning in late March. The family requested immediate transport to our facility for preparation and viewing. Mr. Pays Hoffman had been a well-known figure in our community, a retired high school principal who'd influenced thousands of students over his 40-year career. The family expected a large turnout for his service, and they wanted everything handled with the dignity befitting someone who dedicated his life to education. I arrived at Mercy General around 2 p.m. to collect Mr. Hoffman. The hospital staff had prepared him according to our standard procedures, and the transfer went smoothly. I positioned him carefully in the transport area, secured everything properly, and programmed the GPS for the 15-minute drive back to our facility. The route from Mercy General to Riverside Memorial follows State Route 47 through downtown, then turns onto Cemetery Road for the final approach to our building. It's a drive I've made hundreds of times, familiar enough that I can focus on driving carefully while maintaining the respectful silence appropriate for this work. But about 5 minutes into the transport, I began hearing something that shouldn't have been possible. It started as a soft murmuring from the back of the hearse, so quiet I initially thought it might be road noise or the sound of equipment settling during transport. But as I listened more carefully, the sounds became more distinct. Not mechanical noise, but a human voice speaking in low, measured tones. At first, I assumed it was interference from a radio or phone transmission, maybe bleeding through the vehicle's sound system. But the voice was coming from the transport area, and it was speaking with the kind of careful diction I associated with Mr. Hoffman's years as an educator. Which was impossible, because Mr. Hoffman had been dead for 3 hours and hadn't been able to speak for 5 years. I pulled over into the parking lot of a small church about halfway to our destination, needing to understand what I was hearing. I turned off the engine and sat in complete silence, listening carefully to the sounds from the transport area. The voice continued speaking, clearer now without the background noise of driving. It was definitely Mr. Hoffman's voice. I'd heard him speak many times during school board meetings before his illness, but the words came out with the fluid ease of someone whose throat worked perfectly. He was having a conversation, not talking to himself or rambling incoherently, but engaged in what sounded like a two-sided discussion, complete with pauses for responses I couldn't hear. His tone was earnest, apologetic, filled with the kind of emotion that comes when someone needs to address long-standing regrets. "I know I should have said something sooner," he was saying. "I know you waited for me to find the courage, and I let you down. I let both of us down." A pause, as if listening to a response. "You were right about the Morrison boy. I knew he was struggling at home, knew there were problems I should have reported, but I was afraid of making things worse, afraid of being wrong. I should have trusted my instincts and protected him." Another pause, longer this time. "I think about it every day, Annie. Every day for 37 years. I think about what might have happened if I'd been braver, if I'd been the kind of principal who put children's safety above my own comfort." The conversation continued for several more minutes, with Mr. Hoffman apologizing for decisions made decades earlier, expressing regret for opportunities missed, and speaking with the clarity of someone finally able to address unfinished business. His voice carried the weight of years spent unable to vocalize thoughts that had clearly been consuming him. I realized I was overhearing Mr. Hoffman's final conversation with his daughter Annie, not the living Annie, who'd sat beside his hospital bed, but some version of her that existed in whatever space the dead occupy when they need to resolve earthly concerns. When the conversation ended and silence returned to the hearse, I completed the transport to our facility and documented everything according to normal procedures. But I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd heard, especially the references to someone named Morrison and events from 37 years earlier. That evening, I did something I'd never done before. I requested a copy of the GPS audio recording from that transport. Our system had captured everything, and I wanted to confirm that what I'd experienced was real, rather than some kind of stress-induced hallucination. The recording was crystal clear. Mr. Hoffman's voice, speaking with perfect diction despite 5 years of silence, having an intense conversation about regrets and missed opportunities. But the recording only captured his side of the dialogue. The responses he'd been listening to remained inaudible, existing in frequencies beyond normal recording equipment. I researched the Morrison reference, checking old newspaper archives and school records from Mr. Hoffman's career. In 1986, a student named David Morrison had committed suicide during his senior year. The investigation had revealed a history of abuse at home, and several teachers had later admitted they'd suspected problems but hadn't known how to intervene effectively. Mr. Hoffman had been principal at the time, and newspaper accounts mentioned that he'd taken the boy's death particularly hard, implementing new policies for identifying and reporting suspected abuse. But apparently, the guilt over not acting sooner had stayed with him through his retirement and into his final years. The next day, I attended Mr. Hoffman's viewing to pay my respects. Annie was greeting visitors near the casket, thanking people for coming and sharing memories of her father's impact on their lives. When I approached her, I mentioned that I'd been the one to transport her father from the hospital. "Thank you for taking such good care of him," she said. "Dad was always particular about dignity and respect. He would have appreciated your professionalism." I hesitated, then decided to share something that might bring her comfort. During the transport, I heard your father speaking, I said carefully. It sounded like he was having an important conversation, working through some things that had been weighing on him. I thought you should know that he seemed to find peace with whatever he needed to resolve. Annie's eyes filled with tears, but she smiled. He talked to me every day during his illness, even after he lost his voice. I could see him forming words, trying to tell me things that mattered to him. I always wished I could hear what he was trying to say. He was apologizing for something involving a student named Morrison, I said. He seemed to feel he hadn't done enough to help when he should have. Annie's expression shifted to recognition and relief. David Morrison. Dad never got over that boy's death. He changed so many policies afterward, helped so many other kids because of what he learned from that tragedy. But he never forgave himself for not seeing the signs sooner. She looked toward her father's casket, where he lay in peaceful rest, his hands folded over the suit he'd worn to every graduation ceremony for 40 years. I'm glad he finally got to talk about it, she said. I'm glad he found a way to let go of that guilt. Over the following weeks, I found myself paying closer attention during transports, wondering if other deceased individuals might use the journey between death and burial to address unfinished business. Most transports proceeded in normal silence, but occasionally I'd hear soft murmuring or what sounded like one-sided conversations from the back of the hearse. I learned not to investigate these sounds too closely. Some conversations are meant to be private, even when they happen in the liminal space between life and whatever comes after death. My job is to provide safe transport with dignity and respect, not to intrude on final reconciliations between the dead and the people they need to address. But Mr. Hoffman's case taught me that death doesn't always end our ability to communicate with the people who matter most to us. Sometimes it simply changes the methods we use, allowing conversations that couldn't happen in life to finally take place during the transition between worlds. The GPS system in my hearse continues to record audio automatically, creating an archive of final journeys that includes both silent transports and mysterious conversations. I don't review those recordings unless there's a specific reason, respecting the privacy of communications that happen beyond normal human hearing. Some transports carry more than just the departed. Sometimes they carry the weight of unfinished relationships, unspoken apologies, and the kind of love that refuses to be silenced by death or disease. Mr. Theodore Hoffman spent 5 years unable to speak to his daughter about the guilt that consumed him. But in the space between his death and his burial, he found his voice again and used it to finally address the regrets that had shaped his final decades. Sometimes the dead have conversations we're not meant to overhear, but sometimes knowing those conversations happened can bring comfort to the living who loved them. Reflections sometimes show more than what stands before them. I'm Dave Sullivan, and I work maintenance at Heritage Funeral Home, keeping the building and grounds in proper condition for the families we serve. It's detailed work that requires attention to things most people never notice. The way light falls across viewing room walls, how flowers reflect in polished surfaces, the importance of maintaining an environment where grief can unfold with dignity. But some reflections reveal things that shouldn't be there. Heritage Funeral Home was built in 1963, designed with a kind of classical elegance that provides comfort during life's most difficult moments. Large windows allow natural light to soften the atmosphere, and strategically placed mirrors help create the illusion of space in rooms where families gather to say goodbye. Everything about the building's design prioritizes the emotional needs of grieving people. Viewing Room A is our largest space, capable of accommodating up to 150 people for services. The room features 3 large mirrors positioned to reflect light and create visual depth. One behind the seating area, one along the side wall, and one positioned to give families a view of floral arrangements from multiple angles. The mirrors are original to the building, backed with silver that's developed the subtle patina of age. My maintenance schedule includes weekly cleaning of all mirrors throughout the building, using specialized cleaners that won't damage the antique silvering. It's precise work that requires the right materials and careful technique, especially with mirrors that have been reflecting funeral services for over 60 years. You develop an eye for imperfections, learning to spot the smallest smudges or streaks that might distract from a service. But for the past 3 months, the mirror behind the seating area in viewing room A has been reflecting something that isn't there. It started in January, during the Hendricks family service. I was doing final preparations in the room, adjusting flower arrangements and checking that everything looked perfect for the family's arrival. When I glanced in the mirror to verify the positioning of chairs in the back row, I noticed an extra figure reflected among the empty seats. A middle-aged man in a worn brown suit stood in the back corner of the room, hands clasped behind his back, observing the preparations with the posture of someone who understood funeral protocols perfectly. But when I turned to look directly at that corner, no one was there. I assumed it was an optical illusion, maybe shadows from the floral arrangements or a trick of light from the windows. Mirrors can play games with perception, especially in rooms where lighting changes throughout the day. But when I looked back at the mirror, the figure remained clearly visible, standing respectfully among the empty chairs, as if waiting for the service to begin. The reflection was incredibly detailed. I could see the man's slightly graying hair, combed in the style popular decades earlier. His brown suit was well maintained, but showed the wear of frequent use, and his posture suggested someone accustomed to standing for long periods while observing formal ceremonies. He looked like he belonged in the room, like he had every right to be there. But he existed only in the mirror. During the Hendricks service that afternoon, I positioned myself where I could observe both the room and the mirror simultaneously. The family and friends filled the chairs, creating the kind of gathering that honors a life well lived. But in the mirror's reflection, the man in the brown suit stood among them, visible only in that silvered surface. He remained throughout the entire service, maintaining his respectful posture while the pastor spoke and family members shared memories. When mourners approached the casket to pay their final respects, he moved aside courteously, giving them space while continuing his quiet observation. But no one in the room showed any awareness of his presence. After the service ended and the family left for the burial, I stayed behind to clean and reset the room for the next day's service. The man in the brown suit remained visible in the mirror until I turned off the lights and locked the room. Only then did his reflection fade into the dark. I began paying closer attention to the mirror during subsequent services, documenting when the figure appeared and noting any patterns in his behavior. He showed up for every service held in viewing room A, always taking the same respectful position in the back corner, always wearing the same brown suit, always maintaining the same quiet attention to the proceedings. His presence became predictable, even comforting in a strange way. He never disrupted services or caused any problems for families. He simply stood witness to the ceremonies, like an unofficial guardian, ensuring that proper respect was being paid to the deceased. But I needed to understand who he was and why he appeared only in that particular mirror. I researched Heritage Funeral Home's history, looking through old photographs and employee records for anyone who matched the description of the man in the brown suit. The search took several weeks, combing through archives that documented 60 years of services, staff changes, and building modifications. I found him in a staff photograph from 1987. William Hayes, funeral director from 1971 to 1987, standing in viewing room A during the dedication ceremony for the building's 15th anniversary. He wore the same brown suit I'd been seeing in the mirror, stood with the same dignified posture, and had the same slightly graying hair combed in the same careful style. According to the records, William Hayes had collapsed and died in viewing room A during his own retirement party on December 15, 1987. He'd been giving a speech about his dedication to serving families during their most difficult times when he suffered a massive heart attack. He died in the same room where he'd spent 16 years helping people say goodbye to their loved ones. The photograph showed William Hayes standing in exactly the spot where I'd been seeing his reflection in the mirror, the back corner of viewing room A, hands clasped behind his back, observing a ceremony with the respectful attention that had defined his career. Knowing his identity changed how I experienced his appearances. William Hayes wasn't a mysterious intruder or supernatural threat. He was a dedicated professional, continuing to do the job he'd loved, ensuring that families received the respectful service they deserved during their time of grief. I started acknowledging his presence during my maintenance work, nodding toward the back corner of the room when I saw his reflection in the mirror. It seemed like the appropriate thing to do, recognizing a colleague who was still fulfilling his responsibilities, even after death had ended his official employment. His reflection began appearing more frequently, not just during services, but also during my cleaning and preparation work. I'd see him observing my efforts to maintain the room's appearance, occasionally nodding in what seemed like approval when I paid extra attention to details that enhanced the space's dignity. During one particularly busy week in March, when we hosted 5 services in 3 days, I noticed that William Hayes's reflection showed signs of fatigue. His posture remained respectful, but he appeared to be working as hard as the rest of our staff to ensure every family received appropriate care. That's when I realized he wasn't just observing services, he was actively participating in them, providing the kind of professional oversight that ensures everything meets the standards families deserve. I decided to share my discovery with Mrs. Patterson, Heritage's current funeral director. She'd worked with William Hayes during her early years in the business, and I thought she might want to know that her former mentor was still contributing to the funeral home's operation. Mrs. Patterson listened to my description of the man in the brown suit, then accompanied me to viewing room A to see the reflection for herself. We stood in front of the mirror together, and she immediately recognized the figure standing in the back corner. "That's William Hayes," she confirmed, her voice filled with both recognition and wonder. "He trained me when I first started here, taught me everything I know about serving families with dignity and respect. He always said that funeral direction was a calling that didn't end with retirement." She paused, studying the reflection of her former mentor. "He died giving a speech about how honored he felt to serve families during their most difficult moments," she continued. "He said that helping people say goodbye properly was the most important work anyone could do, and that he hoped his influence would continue even after he was gone." Mrs. Patterson made the decision to leave William Hayes's reflection undisturbed. As long as he continued to observe services without causing problems for families, she saw his presence as a blessing rather than something that needed to be resolved or removed. "He's still doing the job he loved," she said simply. "And frankly, having William Hayes overseeing our services gives me confidence that we're maintaining the standards he established here." William Hayes continues to appear in the mirror behind the seating area in viewing room A. His reflection has become part of the room's character, a reminder that dedication to serving grieving families transcends the normal boundaries of employment and mortality. Sometimes, during particularly moving services, I notice that his reflection shows signs of emotion, a hand raised to wipe away tears that exist only in the mirror, shoulders that shake slightly with the kind of feeling that comes from witnessing genuine love and loss. He's still doing his job, still ensuring that every service meets the standards of dignity and respect that defined his 16-year career at Heritage Funeral Home. Death ended his physical presence, but it couldn't end his commitment to the families who trusted him with their most precious farewells. Reflections sometimes show more than what stands before them. In viewing room A's mirror, they show the continuing presence of someone who understood that funeral service is more than a job. It's a sacred responsibility that extends beyond the normal limits of professional duty. William Hayes found a way to keep serving families even after his own funeral ended. His reflection in that 60-year-old mirror serves as both comfort and inspiration, reminding everyone who works at Heritage that the most important work we do involves helping people say goodbye with love, dignity, and the assurance that their grief is witnessed and honored. Some sorrows leave permanent marks on the places where they unfold. I'm Rosa Martinez, and I've been HVAC technician for Sacred Heart Memorial Chapel for 6 years. My job involves maintaining the climate systems that keep the building comfortable for families during services, ensuring proper temperature, humidity, and air circulation so that grief can unfold in physical comfort, even when emotional comfort feels impossible. But some areas of the building resist every attempt at normal climate control. Sacred Heart Memorial serves families from across our rural county, hosting everything from large community gatherings to intimate family services. The main chapel seats 200 people in wooden pews that date back to the building's construction in 1958. High ceilings and stained glass windows create an atmosphere of reverence, while modern HVAC systems maintain the precise environmental conditions necessary for comfort during emotionally difficult ceremonies. The heating and cooling systems are state-of-the-art, installed 3 years ago when the chapel underwent major renovations. Digital thermostats control temperature zones throughout the building, allowing precise climate management for different areas based on occupancy and use. The system operates so efficiently that temperature variations of more than 2 degrees in any zone trigger automatic adjustments and diagnostic alerts. But Pew number 7 creates its own microclimate that defies every principle of mechanical engineering. It started during my routine quarterly maintenance in September. I was checking airflow and temperature readings throughout the chapel, documenting the performance of each zone to ensure optimal operation before the busy autumn season. Every area of the building registered exactly as expected. Steady 72 degrees, proper humidity levels, consistent air circulation, except around Pew 7. My digital thermometer showed a consistent 12-degree temperature drop in the immediate vicinity of that pew. Not gradually cooler, as you might expect from a drafty window or inadequate insulation, but an abrupt change from 72 degrees to 60 degrees within a radius of approximately 4 feet around the pew itself. I checked for obvious causes: blocked vents, insulation problems, structural issues that might create cold spots. The nearest heating vent was functioning perfectly, delivering warm air at the correct temperature and volume. The windows were properly sealed, and the building's insulation met all current efficiency standards. There was no mechanical explanation for the localized temperature anomaly. I adjusted the zone controls, increasing the heating output to compensate for whatever was causing the cold spot. The system responded appropriately, delivering additional heated air to the area around Pew 7. But the temperature remained 12 degrees below the rest of the chapel, as if the cold was being generated by something the heating system couldn't overcome. Over the following weeks, I documented the temperature anomaly during various conditions: empty chapel, occupied chapel, different weather patterns, different times of day. The cold spot around Pew 7 remained constant regardless of external factors or system adjustments. It was always exactly 12 degrees colder than the surrounding area, creating a zone of inexplicable chill in an otherwise perfectly climate-controlled environment. I researched the building's history, looking for any structural modifications or incidents that might explain the persistent cold spot. Sacred Heart Memorial had operated continuously since 1958, hosting thousands of services for families throughout the county. The building had undergone normal maintenance and updates over the decades, but nothing suggested any trauma or unusual events associated with Pew 7 specifically. Then I found the church records from before Sacred Heart Memorial became a funeral chapel. The building had originally served as Sacred Heart Catholic Church from 1958 to 1993, when the congregation built a larger facility across town. During those 35 years, it had been the spiritual center for our rural community, hosting weddings, baptisms, regular services, and funerals for generations of local families. Pew 7 had been where Martha Clemens sat every Sunday for 43 years. Martha had been a founding member of Sacred Heart Church, one of the families who'd helped raise money for construction and who'd attended faithfully from the first service in 1958. She'd claimed Pew 7 as her regular seat, and had occupied it for 4 decades of Sundays, through marriages and births and deaths, through personal celebrations and community tragedies. On November 12, 1993, during the church's final service before the congregation moved to their new building, Martha Clemens suffered a massive stroke while sitting in pew 7. It happened during the funeral service for her own son, Thomas, who died in a car accident at age 47. She collapsed during the reading of the 23rd Psalm, falling forward in the pew where she'd worshipped for 43 years, dying from overwhelming grief at the funeral of her only child. The paramedics pronounced her dead in pew 7, surrounded by the congregation that had been her spiritual family for nearly half a century. Understanding Martha's story changed how I experienced the cold spot around pew 7. It wasn't a mechanical failure or structural problem. It was the permanent imprint of a mother's grief, so profound it had altered the physical environment where it reached its breaking point. I stopped trying to correct the temperature anomaly, recognizing it as a memorial to loss, too deep for normal healing. Instead, I adjusted my maintenance procedures to work around it, ensuring the rest of the chapel remained comfortable, while acknowledging that some spaces carry sorrows too powerful to overcome with heated air. During services, I began observing how families and mourners reacted to the area around pew 7. Most people avoided sitting there without conscious awareness, instinctively choosing other seating, even when the chapel was crowded and space was limited. Children especially seemed sensitive to the cold spot, often asking to move to different seats or requesting jackets even when the rest of the building felt perfectly comfortable. But some mourners were drawn to pew 7 specifically. I noticed that parents who'd lost children often found themselves sitting in that pew, seemingly unaware of the temperature drop, but somehow comforted by the space. They would settle into the cold zone and remain there throughout entire services, as if the chill provided a kind of solace that normal warmth couldn't offer. During one particularly difficult service, the funeral of a 6-year-old girl who died from leukemia, I watched the child's mother walk directly to pew 7 and sit in the exact spot where Martha Clemens had, quote, collapsed 43 years earlier. She sat through the entire service without showing any awareness of the cold, but I could see her breath forming small clouds in the chilled air around her. After the service, I approached her gently, concerned about her exposure to the cold zone. "Ma'am, I noticed you might be cold sitting in that particular pew," I said. "I could adjust the heating if you'd like." She looked at me with the hollow eyes of fresh grief, then glanced back at pew 7. "It felt right sitting there," she said quietly, "like someone understood, like I wasn't alone in this." That's when I realized that Martha Clemens's permanent presence in pew 7 served a purpose beyond my understanding. Her grief had become a beacon for other parents experiencing similar loss, creating a space where the worst kind of sorrow could be witnessed and shared without words. I researched Martha's life more thoroughly, learning about her son Thomas and the circumstances of their deaths. Thomas had been a volunteer firefighter who died responding to a house fire, trying to save a family trapped on the second floor. He'd gotten the children out safely, but had been overcome by smoke while attempting to rescue their father. Martha had been incredibly proud of her son's service to the community, but his death had shattered something fundamental in her ability to cope with loss. Friends said she'd never recovered from the shock of losing her only child, especially in such a heroic but tragic way. The November day when she died in pew 7 had been the culmination of 3 weeks of grief, too overwhelming for her 76-year-old heart to bear. She'd sat in her regular pew, listening to words about her son's sacrifice and service, and had simply been overcome by the magnitude of love and loss contained in a mother's heart. I began maintaining a small memorial in my maintenance records, documenting the temperature in pew 7 as a way of honoring Martha's presence and the comfort she continued to provide to other grieving parents. The cold spot never varied, always exactly 12 degrees below the ambient temperature, always precisely the same size and shape, always present regardless of season or weather conditions. During the winter months, when the heating system worked harder to maintain comfortable temperatures throughout the chapel, I noticed that the energy consumption around Pew 7 actually decreased rather than increased. It was as if Martha's presence helped cool the area naturally, reducing the load on the climate control system rather than fighting against it. The phenomenon attracted the attention of our chapel director, Mrs. Harrison, who'd worked at Sacred Heart Memorial since its conversion from church to funeral home. She'd known Martha Clemens personally and remembered the tragic circumstances of her death. Martha was the kind of woman who never stopped taking care of people, Mrs. Harrison told me, even after Thomas died. Even when she was drowning in her own grief, she was bringing casseroles to other families who were struggling. It makes sense that she'd find a way to keep helping parents who are going through what she went through. Mrs. Harrison made the decision to acknowledge Martha's presence officially. She placed a small plaque near Pew 7 that read, "In memory of Martha Clemens, 1917-1993, who understood that love transcends loss and that no parent should grieve alone." The plaque didn't mention the temperature anomaly or the supernatural aspects of Martha's continued presence. Instead, it honored her memory and provided context for families who found themselves drawn to that particular seating area during services for children. Word spread quietly through our community about Pew 7 and its special significance for parents who'd lost children. It became an unofficial gathering place where such grief could be acknowledged without explanation, where the worst kind of loss could be witnessed by someone who'd experienced it herself. I continued to monitor the temperature around Pew 7 as part of my regular maintenance routine, documenting Martha's consistent presence as a professional courtesy to a colleague who refuses to abandon her post. The cold spot remains exactly as it has been for 6 years, 12 degrees below ambient temperature, consistent in size and intensity, providing comfort to those who need it most. Sometimes, during particularly moving services for children, I notice that the cold around Pew 7 becomes less harsh, more like a gentle cooling breeze than the sharp chill I usually measure. On those occasions, the temperature difference decreases to 8 or 9 degrees, as if Martha is moderating her presence to provide comfort without causing discomfort. The HVAC systems at Sacred Heart Memorial continue to operate at peak efficiency throughout the rest of the building. Only Pew 7 maintains its own climate, governed by forces that exist beyond mechanical engineering, but serve purposes that mechanical engineering could never fulfill. Some sorrows leave permanent marks on the places where they unfold. Martha Clemens's grief became part of the physical structure of Sacred Heart Memorial, creating a space where similar grief can be acknowledged, witnessed, and gently held by someone who understands its weight. The temperature drop around Pew 7 isn't a problem to be solved. It's a feature to be honored. It's Martha's way of continuing to serve her community, providing a cold but comforting presence for parents whose hearts have been shattered in the same way hers was 43 years ago. Some climate control issues require technical solutions. Others require recognition that certain spaces serve purposes beyond human engineering, maintained by presences that understand the importance of witnessing grief without trying to fix it. Martha Clemens keeps Pew 7 cold because some comfort comes not from warmth, but from knowing you're not alone in the chill. Music has a way of outlasting the musicians who create it. I'm Linda Foster, Chapel Coordinator at Harmony Memorial Services, responsible for managing the details that make funeral services meaningful for families, coordinating with clergy, arranging music, ensuring that every element of a ceremony honors the deceased while providing comfort to those left behind. But some music continues long after the musicians have played their final notes. Harmony Memorial's main chapel features a 1947 Steinway console organ, a magnificent instrument that's provided musical accompaniment for thousands of services over the past 76 years. The organ requires regular tuning and maintenance, but when properly maintained, it produces the kind of rich, resonant tones that can transform grief into something bearable, even beautiful. Mrs. Dorothy Kim, had been our organist for 37 years, before dementia forced her retirement in 2019. She'd played for every type of service we hosted: traditional hymns for religious ceremonies, classical pieces for secular celebrations of life, contemporary songs arranged for organ, when families requested music that held special meaning for the deceased. Dorothy had an extraordinary gift for reading the emotional needs of a congregation and choosing music that provided exactly the right kind of comfort. She could play complex pieces from memory, adapt popular songs for organ performance, and create musical transitions that helped mourners move through the different stages of grief during a single service. But in her final years, dementia gradually stripped away her musical abilities. First, she lost the capacity to read sheet music, then her ability to remember complex pieces, and finally her recognition of the instrument she'd played with such skill for nearly 4 decades. By the time she retired, Dorothy could only remember one song completely: Amazing Grace, the hymn she'd learned as a child and played so many times it had become part of her muscle memory. Dorothy died peacefully at the memory care facility in October 2021, surrounded by family members who spoke about her dedication to providing musical comfort during people's darkest moments. Her funeral service was held in our chapel, with a professional organist brought in from the city to play the complex pieces that had defined Dorothy's repertoire. But the chapel's organ had other plans for honoring Dorothy's memory. The first occurrence happened 3 days after Dorothy's funeral. I was working late, finalizing arrangements for the next day's services, when I heard the organ begin to play. Not a full hymn or complex piece, just 3 notes repeated slowly: G, A, B flat, the opening notes of Amazing Grace. I walked into the chapel expecting to find someone practicing or testing the instrument, but the bench was empty. The organ continued playing those 3 notes with perfect timing and tone, as if invisible hands were pressing the keys. The sound was exactly right, not the electronic reproduction of a recording, but the authentic resonance of the Steinway's pipes responding to skilled touch. I checked the chapel thoroughly, looking for any explanation for the music. The organ's power was on, as it always was, to prevent damage to the electronic components. But there was no one at the console, no programmed sequences, no automated systems that could produce those specific notes. Just the opening measures of Amazing Grace played with the gentle touch that had been Dorothy's signature style. The music stopped after about 5 minutes, fading naturally as if the organist had simply lifted their hands from the keys. The chapel returned to its normal silence, leaving me to wonder if I'd experienced a malfunction of the instrument or something beyond mechanical explanation. I mentioned the incident to our building maintenance staff, asking them to inspect the organ for any technical problems that might cause it to play on its own. They found the instrument in perfect working order, all connections secure, all electronic components functioning normally. No programming or automation that could account for the mysterious music. But the 3 notes continued every night at closing time. It became part of my routine to listen for Dorothy's musical signature as I finished my daily work. Always the same 3 notes: G, A, B flat, played with the same gentle timing that had characterized her performance style. Always at closing time, when the chapel was empty and quiet, as if Dorothy was providing a musical benediction for the day's activities. The timing was too consistent to be coincidental. Dorothy had always stayed late to practice, often remaining in the chapel until 8 or 9 p.m. to work on pieces for upcoming services. She'd told me many times that she preferred the quiet evening hours for practice, when she could hear the organ's true voice without competition from traffic noise or building activity. I started acknowledging the music when it happened, saying goodnight to Dorothy as if she were still sitting at the bench. It felt appropriate, recognizing a colleague who'd contributed so much to our services and who seemed to be continuing her dedication even after death. "Thank you for the music, Dorothy," I'd say softly as the 3 notes faded into silence. "Rest well." Word of the evening organ music spread among our staff, and several people asked to stay late to witness the phenomenon. Dorothy's music became less mysterious and more comforting as we realized she was simply maintaining her practice routine, even if she could only remember 3 notes of the song that had meant most to her. But the most profound experience came during the Henderson family service in late November. 8-year-old Emma Henderson had died from complications of cystic fibrosis, and her family requested a service that would celebrate her love of music and her dream of learning to play piano. They brought recordings of Emma practicing simple songs on the small keyboard her parents had bought for her 6th birthday. The service was heartbreaking in the way that children's funerals always are. Too much grief concentrated in too small a space. Too many questions about fairness and purpose that have no satisfying answers. Emma's parents spoke about her determination to keep practicing piano despite her illness, how she'd insisted on playing for them even when breathing was difficult. During the final prayer, as the pastor spoke about Emma's musical gifts and her desire to share music with others, the chapel organ began to play. Not just the 3 notes we'd grown accustomed to, but the complete first verse of Amazing Grace, played with a gentle precision that had been Dorothy's trademark. But this wasn't just Dorothy's music. Woven into the familiar melody were the simpler notes of a child learning to play piano. Tentative, sometimes slightly off-tempo, but filled with the enthusiasm of someone discovering the joy of making music. Dorothy was accompanying Emma, providing the skilled foundation that allowed a little girl's musical dreams to be realized in a way that physical illness had prevented. The duet continued through the entire first verse, with Dorothy's experienced organ technique supporting Emma's eager but imperfect piano melody. It was the kind of musical collaboration that might have happened if they'd had the chance to meet in life. An experienced musician encouraging a young beginner, helping her dreams take flight. When the music ended, there wasn't a dry eye in the chapel. Emma's mother later told me it was the most beautiful thing she'd ever heard. Exactly the kind of musical celebration Emma would have wanted for her funeral. It sounded like Emma was finally able to play the way she'd always dreamed, she said through tears, like someone was helping her, teaching her, letting her be part of something bigger than what she could do alone. Dorothy's evening practice sessions continued after the Henderson service, but now they occasionally included variations on the 3 opening notes of Amazing Grace. Sometimes the music sounded like teaching exercises, simple melodies repeated patiently, as if Dorothy were working with invisible students who needed encouragement and practice. I realized that Dorothy had found a way to continue the work that had defined her life, providing musical comfort during times of grief and sharing her skills with others who wanted to learn. Death hadn't ended her service to the families who needed her gift. It had simply expanded her capacity to help in ways that transcended physical limitations. The chapel organ continues to play Dorothy's evening benediction, 3 notes that serve as a reminder that some forms of service extend beyond the normal boundaries of employment and mortality. Her music has become part of Harmony Memorial's daily rhythm, a gentle close to each day's work that honors both the dead and the living. Sometimes, families mention hearing soft organ music during private moments in the chapel. Not intrusive or distracting, but quietly supportive, like having a musician who understands exactly what kind of comfort each situation requires. Dorothy's musical sensitivity didn't end with her death. It continues to serve families who need the healing power of well-chosen music. Music has a way of outlasting the musicians who create it. But sometimes, the musicians find ways to outlast physical death, continuing to serve others through the art form that gave their lives meaning and purpose. Dorothy Kim spent 37 years providing musical comfort to grieving families. Dementia took away most of her repertoire, but it couldn't take away her understanding of when people need music most. Her 3 notes of Amazing Grace continue to remind us that some gifts are too precious to be silenced by death, too important to be limited by the boundaries between life and whatever comes after. The organist's bench may appear empty during our evening closing routine, but Dorothy's music proves that the most dedicated musicians never really stop playing. They just learn to perform from places we can't see, for audiences that include both the living and the dead, who gather in spaces where music transcends mortality. Some deliveries are meant for recipients who exist beyond normal understanding. I'm James Park, receiving clerk at Restful Gardens Funeral Home, responsible for managing all deliveries and inventory that keep our operation running smoothly. Flowers, supplies, equipment, personal items from families, everything passes through my hands before finding its proper place in our facility. It's detail-oriented work that requires careful documentation and respect for the significance of every item that comes through our doors. But some deliveries challenge every system I've developed for managing the flow of goods through our facility. Restful Gardens has served our community for 48 years, providing funeral services and maintaining the adjacent cemetery where many of our families choose to lay their loved ones to rest. The cemetery includes a special children's section, established in 1989, after several local families requested a dedicated area where young ones could rest together, surrounded by appropriate memorials and peaceful landscaping. My receiving area is located at the back of the building, with easy access for delivery trucks and clear sight lines to the cemetery grounds. I maintain detailed logs of every delivery, time of arrival, contents, destination within the facility, and signature confirmation. After 12 years in this position, I know the schedule of every regular supplier and the habits of every delivery service that serves our area. The Thursday flower deliveries started appearing in my logs 3 months ago. Every Thursday at exactly 10:15 a.m., I would sign for a delivery of small white daisies addressed to the children in Wing C. The delivery slip would show our address and a standard floral order form, but there was never any indication of who had placed the order or which specific service the flowers were intended for. The problem was that Restful Gardens has never had a Wing C. Our building is organized into sections A and B, viewing rooms, preparation areas, offices, and storage facilities. There is no Wing C, never has been, and our architectural plans show no provision for expansion that would create additional wings. When the first delivery arrived, I assumed it was a mistake. Wrong address, incorrectly labeled, or intended for another funeral home with a similar name. I called the florist listed on the delivery slip, but they had no record of the order. According to their system, no arrangement of white daisies had been scheduled for delivery to our address on that date. But I had signed for the flowers, received them according to standard procedure, and documented everything in my delivery log. The daisies were real, fresh, perfectly arranged in a simple white vase with no identifying card or message. They existed, even though they shouldn't have, according to any official record. I placed the arrangement in our refrigeration unit with other funeral flowers, planning to contact families scheduled for Thursday services to see if anyone had ordered daisies for their ceremonies. But when I checked the cooler the following morning, the flowers were gone. Not wilted, not moved to another location, completely disappeared, as if they'd never existed. The vase remained, cleaned and empty, sitting exactly where I'd placed the arrangement. But every single daisy had vanished without leaving any trace of petals, stems, or the water they'd been arranged in. The following Thursday, the same delivery arrived at exactly 10:15 a.m. Same white daisies, same vase, same address label for the children in Wing C. When I questioned the delivery driver, he showed me a work order that matched the delivery slip perfectly. But when I asked him to contact his dispatcher for clarification, his radio produced only static. I signed for the flowers again, documented the delivery in my log, and placed them in refrigeration with a note requesting that no one move them without my authorization. Friday morning, they were gone again. Vase cleaned and empty, daisies vanished without explanation. By the third Thursday delivery, I was prepared with camera equipment to document what happened to the flowers overnight. I photographed the arrangement from multiple angles, noting the number of blooms, the water level in the vase, and the exact position where I placed them in the refrigeration unit. But when I reviewed the overnight security footage, I discovered something that changed my understanding of the entire situation. The cameras showed me placing the flowers in the cooler at 10:30 a.m. Thursday. They remained visible and undisturbed until approximately 3 a.m. Friday, when the image began to show something impossible. The flowers appeared to be moving on their own, lifting gently from the vase and floating through the air in a slow, graceful procession toward the cooler door. The security camera couldn't capture where they went after leaving the refrigeration unit, but motion sensors throughout the building tracked movement from the cooler through the main corridor, out the back door, and across the grounds toward the cemetery's children's section. I followed the trail the next Thursday night, positioning myself where I could observe both the building and the cemetery grounds. At exactly 3 a.m., I watched as dozens of white daisies floated through the darkness like tiny stars, moving in a gentle procession toward the children's section of the cemetery. The flowers settled onto individual graves, one daisy per headstone, arranged with the precision of someone who knew exactly which child rested beneath each marker. By dawn, every small grave in the children's section had been adorned with a single white daisy, placed with loving care by hands I couldn't see. I researched the history of the children's section, looking for any connection to Wing C or any explanation for the weekly flower deliveries. What I found in the cemetery records changed everything I thought I understood about the boundaries between the living and the dead. Wing C had been the pediatric ward at Mercy General Hospital from 1947 to 1989, located in a building that was demolished when the hospital expanded and modernized their facilities. During those 42 years, Wing C had been home to hundreds of children receiving treatment for serious illnesses, many of whom had spent months or years in that ward before either recovering or passing away. The children buried in our cemetery's special section had all been patients in Wing C at some point during their final illnesses. They'd formed friendships in that hospital ward, supporting each other through treatments and procedures, creating a community of young patients who understood each other's fears and hopes in ways their families couldn't always comprehend. When Wing C was demolished in 1989, the hospital held a memorial service for the children who died there over the years. The families donated funds to establish the children's section at Restful Gardens Cemetery, ensuring that their young ones would rest together in the same kind of community they'd found in the hospital ward. The weekly delivery of white daisies was coming from Wing C, not the physical building that had been demolished 34 years ago, but the spiritual space where those children's memories and connections continued to exist. Someone or something associated with that pediatric ward was ensuring that the children buried in our cemetery received weekly flowers, maintaining the care and attention they'd known during their time in Wing C. I stopped trying to redirect or question the Thursday deliveries. Instead, I began facilitating them, ensuring that my schedule allowed me to receive the flowers and document their mysterious overnight journey to the cemetery. It became part of my routine, like any other regular delivery that served the needs of families we cared for. The delivery driver who brought the flowers each Thursday gradually became more solid and recognizable over the weeks. At first, he'd seemed somewhat translucent, difficult to focus on clearly, but as I accepted the deliveries without question, he began to appear more substantial, more present. He was a middle-aged man in a hospital maintenance uniform, with a kind of gentle manner that suggested years of working around sick children. His name tag read Roberto, and he always smiled when I signed for the flowers, as if pleased that someone understood the importance of his weekly rounds. One Thursday in late March, Roberto spoke to me for the first time. "Thank you for taking care of the children," he said in accented English that carried the warmth of someone who'd spent decades making sick kids feel safe and loved. "They look forward to the flowers every week. Makes them feel remembered." "How long have you been delivering flowers to Wing C?" I asked. "Since 1973, he replied matter-of-factly. "Started when my own daughter was a patient there. After she passed, I kept bringing flowers for all the children. Somebody needs to make sure they know they're not forgotten." Roberto's delivery schedule had never been interrupted by his own death in 1994, according to the hospital records I found later. He'd been killed in a car accident while driving to work at Mercy General. But his commitment to the children of Wing C had continued unabated for 30 years after his physical death. The Thursday flower deliveries continue to arrive at exactly 10:15 a.m., and I continue to facilitate their mysterious journey to the children's graves. Roberto and I have developed a professional relationship based on mutual respect for the work we're both doing. He provides the flowers, I ensure they reach their intended recipients, and together we maintain a connection between the living and the dead that transcends normal understanding. Sometimes families visiting their children's graves mention finding fresh daisies on the headstones, placed with obvious care, but without any indication of who left them. They assume other family members or cemetery staff are responsible, never suspecting that the flowers come from a demolished hospital ward where their children once played and laughed and supported each other through the hardest times of their short lives. The receiving logs at Restful Gardens now include a permanent entry for Thursday deliveries to Wing C, acknowledging the ongoing needs of children who found ways to maintain the community they cherished during their time in the hospital. Roberto's dedication to his weekly rounds serves as a reminder that some forms of service transcend the normal boundaries between employment and calling, between life and death. Some deliveries are meant for recipients who exist beyond normal understanding, but they're no less real, no less important, and no less deserving of professional courtesy and careful handling. The children of Wing C taught me that community doesn't end with death, and that the love and care they received during their illnesses continues to manifest in ways that honor their memory and their need to remain connected to each other. Roberto's weekly flower deliveries ensure that their graves bloom with the same attention and care they received when they were patients in a pediatric ward that exists now only in the space between memory and eternity. Wing C may have been demolished, but its spirit lives on in a cemetery where children rest together, adorned each week with white daisies that arrive from somewhere beyond normal delivery routes, carried by someone whose dedication to caring for sick children couldn't be ended by his own death. Sometimes the dead refuse to let technology silence their need to communicate. I'm Angela Wright, night receptionist at Tranquil Meadows Funeral Home, working the 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. shift that keeps our phones covered and our facility secure during the quiet hours when grief often feels most overwhelming. It's solitary work that requires patience, compassion, and the ability to provide comfort to callers who are struggling with loss in the middle of the night when darkness makes everything feel more hopeless. But some calls come from numbers that shouldn't be able to connect to our system. Tranquil Meadows has served families in our rural county for 26 years, providing 24-hour phone coverage, because we understand that grief doesn't follow normal business hours. People need to talk when the pain becomes too much to bear alone, when questions arise in the middle of sleepless nights, or when they simply need the comfort of hearing a human voice that understands their situation. The phone system is modern and efficient, equipped with caller ID that displays the name and number of incoming calls. After 8 years working nights, I know the patterns of normal calls. Family members checking on service details, out-of-town relatives confirming travel arrangements, people who can't sleep and need someone to listen while they share memories of loved ones who've passed. But 3 weeks ago, the calls from Dorothy Patterson started arriving every night at exactly 11:43 p.m. The first call came on a Tuesday night in early April. The caller ID showed Patterson, Dorothy, Mobile, with a local number that I recognized from our recent service records. Dorothy Patterson had been buried the previous Monday after a brief battle with pneumonia, surrounded by family who'd spoken lovingly about her dedication to her garden and her habit of calling everyone she cared about just to check on their well-being. When the phone rang at 11:43 p.m., I answered according to my standard protocol. Tranquil Meadows Funeral Home. This is Angela. How may I help you? The line was quiet for several seconds. Then I heard the sound of shallow, labored breathing, as if someone was struggling to catch their breath or fighting through emotion too overwhelming for words. In the background, I could hear what sounded like wind moving through leaves, distant and soft. "Hello?" I said gently. "Are you there? Do you need assistance?" The breathing continued for another moment. Then a voice whispered so quietly I had to strain to hear it. "The flowers need water." The call ended before I could respond, leaving me staring at the phone and wondering if I'd imagined the entire exchange. Dorothy Patterson was dead. She'd been buried 2 days earlier. Her mobile phone had been interred with her, according to her daughter's request that she be buried with the things she'd used most often in life. I documented the call in my night log, noting the time, duration, and content, but wondering if somehow the call had come from a family member using Dorothy's phone or account. It seemed like the only logical explanation, even though the voice had sounded exactly like Dorothy's, elderly, concerned, filled with the gentle authority of someone accustomed to taking care of others. The next night, the same call came at exactly 11:43 p.m. Same caller ID, same shallow breathing, same whispered message. "The flowers need water." This time, I tried to engage the caller in conversation. "Mrs. Patterson? Is this Dorothy Patterson?" I asked softly. The breathing paused, as if the caller was surprised to be recognized or addressed directly. "Yes," came the whispered reply. "The flowers. They're wilting. Someone needs to water them before it's too late." "Which flowers, Mrs. Patterson? Where are the flowers that need water?" But the line had already gone dead, leaving me with more questions than answers, and a growing certainty that I was experiencing something beyond normal grief counseling. I researched Dorothy Patterson's service records and spoke with her daughter Sarah during regular business hours. According to Sarah, Dorothy's phone had indeed been buried with her, still charged and still connected to the family's shared cellular plan. The phone company confirmed that the number was still active, though it shouldn't be receiving or making calls from underground. "Mom was obsessed with her gardens," Sarah told me. "She had flower beds all around her house, and she'd get genuinely distressed if they weren't properly watered. Even during her final illness, she kept asking me to check on the flowers to make sure they were getting enough water." Sarah agreed to visit her mother's house and check on the flower gardens, wondering if somehow Dorothy's spirit was concerned about the plants she'd tended so carefully during her lifetime. What Sarah found explained the urgency behind the nightly phone calls. Dorothy's extensive flower gardens were dying from neglect. The automatic sprinkler system had malfunctioned shortly after her death, and 3 weeks without proper watering had left her carefully tended beds brown and wilted. Roses, daffodils, tulips, and dozens of other varieties that Dorothy had nurtured for decades were shriveling in the spring heat. Sarah immediately arranged for the sprinkler system to be repaired and the gardens to be thoroughly watered. That night, I waited for Dorothy's 11:43 p.m. call, curious to see if resolving the garden crisis would end the mysterious phone communications. The call came at exactly the same time, but this time, Dorothy's voice sounded clearer, stronger, filled with relief rather than urgent concern. "Thank you," she whispered. "They're drinking now. They'll be beautiful again." "You're welcome, Mrs. Patterson," I replied. "I'm glad we could help with the flowers." "I couldn't bear to see them die," she continued, her voice gaining strength, as if the act of communication was becoming easier for her. 43 years I spent making those gardens beautiful. They were my children, in a way. I couldn't let them suffer. The calls continued for the next week, but they gradually changed from urgent pleas to gentle conversations about gardening, about the specific needs of different flowers, and about the satisfaction Dorothy had found in creating beauty that could be shared with neighbors and visitors. She told me about the rose garden she'd planted in memory of her late husband, the daffodils that bloomed every spring to celebrate her daughter's birthday, and the herb garden that had supplied seasonings for family dinners for 2 decades. Each flower bed had a story, a purpose, a connection to the people and experiences that had made Dorothy's life meaningful. "Gardens are about hope," she explained during one of our conversations. "You plant something today knowing it will be beautiful tomorrow, next month, next year. You're creating beauty for people you might never meet, leaving gifts for the future. But Dorothy's concern extended beyond her own gardens. During our nightly conversations, she began mentioning other houses in the neighborhood where flowers were struggling, where elderly homeowners could no longer maintain the gardens they'd loved, where beauty was dying from simple neglect. Mrs. Henderson's roses are getting black spot, she told me one night. She needs to spray them, but I don't think she knows how. And the Johnson's tulips are being eaten by rabbits. They need chicken wire around the beds. I started documenting Dorothy's gardening advice and passing it along to Sarah, who contacted the neighbors Dorothy mentioned. In every case, Dorothy's observations were accurate. Gardens were indeed struggling with the specific problems she'd identified, often issues that wouldn't be obvious to casual observers. Sarah organized a neighborhood gardening group, using her mother's advice to help elderly residents maintain their flower beds and share gardening knowledge. Dorothy's phone calls became a source of community connection, bringing neighbors together around the shared love of beautiful gardens. As spring progressed into summer, Dorothy's gardens responded to proper care and attention. Sarah sent me photographs showing the remarkable recovery. Roses blooming in abundance, flower beds thick with colorful blossoms, the herb garden producing aromatic leaves for family cooking. The gardens looked better than they had in years, as if Dorothy's spirit was somehow contributing to their growth and vitality. The nightly phone calls gradually became less frequent as Dorothy's immediate concerns were addressed. Instead of calling every night, she'd contact me 2 or 3 times per week, usually to share observations about her gardens or to pass along advice for neighbors who needed help with their landscaping. Her voice grew stronger and clearer with each conversation, as if the act of continuing to care for her beloved gardens was providing her with purpose and energy that transcended physical death. The final call came on a warm evening in late June, when Dorothy's gardens were at their peak bloom, and the neighborhood gardening group had successfully resolved most of the local landscaping problems she'd identified. "Angela," she said, her voice now clear and strong, "I want to thank you for listening, for helping me take care of what mattered most to me. The gardens are beautiful now, and the neighbors are working together to keep them that way." "It's been my privilege, Mrs. Patterson," I replied honestly. "Your knowledge and dedication have helped a lot of people." "I can rest now," she said with satisfaction. "The flowers are thriving, the neighbors are taking care of each other, and beauty is growing where it might have died. That's all I ever wanted, to leave the world a little more beautiful than I found it." That was the last call I received from Dorothy Patterson's mobile phone. The number was finally disconnected the following week when the family ended the cellular service. But by then, Dorothy's work was complete. Her gardens continued to flourish under Sarah's care and the neighborhood gardening group's attention. Sometimes families mention finding gardening advice written in the margins of plant care books that appeared in their mailboxes, or discovering that their struggling flower beds improved dramatically after mysterious midnight waterings. Dorothy's influence on the neighborhood's gardens continues in ways that can't be easily explained, but are gratefully received. The night phone system at Tranquil Meadows operates normally now, taking calls from living family members who need comfort and support during difficult nights. But Dorothy Patterson's conversations taught me that grief counseling sometimes involves facilitating connections between the dead and the concerns that gave their lives meaning. Sometimes, the dead refuse to let technology silence their need to communicate with the living, especially when that communication serves purposes larger than personal comfort. Dorothy's phone calls weren't about her own needs. They were about ensuring the continued care of beauty she'd spent decades creating and sharing. Her dedication to her gardens couldn't be ended by death, because that dedication was rooted in love for something beyond herself. The flowers she'd tended became her way of connecting with neighbors, of contributing to community beauty, of leaving gifts for people she'd never meet. Some late-night phone calls come from people who can't sleep due to grief or worry. Others come from people who can't rest until they've ensured that the beauty they created in life continues to flourish after their death. Dorothy Patterson's calls reminded me that love takes many forms, and some of the most profound love is expressed through the patient tending of small, beautiful things that make the world a better place. Some rhythms become so deeply ingrained that death can't break the pattern. I'm Bill Chen, crematory operator at Eternal Rest Memorial Services, responsible for the technical and procedural aspects of cremation that help families choose this option for their loved one's final disposition. It's precise work that requires attention to safety protocols, respect for the deceased, and the kind of steady professionalism that reassures families their loved ones are being treated with appropriate dignity. But some professionals refuse to let retirement or death end their dedication to proper procedures. Eternal Rest has provided cremation services for 18 years, with our facility located in the basement level of the main building to ensure appropriate separation from family areas while maintaining easy access for necessary operations. The crematory equipment is state-of-the-art, designed for efficiency and environmental responsibility, with monitoring systems that ensure every procedure meets strict regulatory standards. The basement layout is straightforward and functional. The crematory chamber, preparation area, storage for urns and containers, and a small office where I maintain the detailed records required for this work. Everything is designed for smooth workflow and respectful handling of the deceased from the moment they're brought down from the main level until their cremated remains are ready for return to families. I work alone during most cremations, following established procedures that ensure proper timing and temperature control, while maintaining the quiet concentration this work requires. The basement is normally silent, except for the controlled sounds of the crematory equipment and the building's ventilation systems. But for the past 6 months, I've been sharing the basement with someone who died there 22 years ago. It started with footsteps during late-night cremations, slow, measured pacing in the storage area adjacent to the crematory chamber, 13 steps from the preparation table toward the chamber, a pause, then 13 steps back. The rhythm was so consistent, I initially assumed it was some kind of mechanical sound from the building's systems, maybe a pump cycling or equipment settling. But the footsteps only occurred during active cremations, never during my regular maintenance work or when the basement was empty. They would begin shortly after I started a cremation cycle and continue throughout the entire process, maintaining the same 13-step pattern with mechanical precision. After several weeks of hearing the footsteps, I began counting them more carefully, wondering if there was significance to the specific number. The pattern never varied: 13 steps toward the crematory chamber, 13 steps back toward the preparation area, repeated continuously for the duration of each cremation. I mentioned the sounds to our building maintenance supervisor, suggesting there might be equipment issues in the basement that needed attention, but inspection of all mechanical systems revealed no problems that could account for rhythmic sounds resembling footsteps. The maintenance records, however, revealed something interesting about the basement's history. Harold Voss had been our previous crematory operator from 1994 to 2001, when he suffered a fatal heart attack while working alone during a late-night cremation. According to the incident report, Harold had been found collapsed in the basement storage area, apparently stricken while pacing between the preparation table and crematory chamber during his normal workflow. The EMTs had documented Harold's habit of counting steps during cremations, 13 steps each way between the preparation area and chamber, a personal ritual he'd developed to time procedures and maintain focus during the solitary work. His family confirmed that Harold had been obsessive about proper procedures, never varying from established routines that ensured respectful and efficient service. Understanding Harold's story changed how I experienced the basement footsteps. They weren't random sounds or equipment noise. They were the continuation of a work pattern that had defined 22 years of dedicated service, maintained by someone who couldn't abandon his responsibilities even after death. I started acknowledging Harold's presence during cremations, speaking to him as I would any colleague, sharing workspace and procedures. "Good evening, Harold," I'd say when the footsteps began. Thank you for keeping watch over the operation." The footsteps seemed to respond to recognition, becoming slightly softer, but maintaining their steady rhythm throughout each cremation cycle. Harold was still doing his job, still counting steps, still ensuring that proper procedures were followed for every person entrusted to our care. During particularly difficult cremations, young people, accident victims, cases where families were struggling with their choice of cremation over burial, Harold's presence became more pronounced. The footsteps would be clearer, more deliberate, as if he was providing extra attention to ensure these challenging cases received the same careful handling he'd provided during his years of service. I found Harold's old procedure manuals in the basement office files, filled with handwritten notes about timing, temperature control, and special considerations for different types of cases. His attention to detail was extraordinary, and his notes revealed someone who understood that crematory work required both technical precision and deep respect for the people whose final disposition he was handling. One note, written in Harold's careful handwriting, particularly resonated with me. "Every person who comes through this chamber deserves the same careful attention I would want for my own family. Count the steps, maintain the rhythm, never hurry the process. This is sacred work that requires sacred attention." I began following Harold's 13-step pattern during my own cremations, finding that the measured pacing helped maintain appropriate timing and provided a meditative rhythm that enhanced focus and respect. The work became a collaboration between past and present, with Harold's experience guiding my understanding of proper procedures. Sometimes, during complex cases that required special handling, I would hear Harold's footsteps change patterns slightly, maybe 15 or 16 steps instead of 13, as if he was adjusting procedures based on specific circumstances. When I followed his modified pattern, I invariably found that the adjusted timing produced better results. The most profound experience came during the cremation of 8-year-old Emma Rodriguez, who died from complications of leukemia. Her family had chosen cremation reluctantly, struggling with doubts about whether they were making the right decision for their little girl. As I prepared Emma for cremation, following all protocols for pediatric cases, Harold's footsteps began earlier than usual and continued with unusual intensity. But the pattern was different, softer, gentler, with longer pauses at each end of the 13-step journey, as if he was taking extra time to ensure everything was perfect for this young person. During Emma's cremation, I heard something I'd never experienced before, what sounded like humming, so soft it was barely audible above the equipment noise. It was a lullaby, sung with the kind of tenderness that comes from understanding how precious children are and how carefully they need to be treated, especially during their final journey. When I shared the experience with Emma's family during the return of her cremated remains, they mentioned that their daughter had always found comfort in lullabies when she was frightened or in pain. Knowing that Harold had provided that gentle comfort during her cremation brought them peace about their decision to choose cremation over burial. Harold's footsteps continue during every cremation I perform, maintaining the 13-step pattern that ensured proper attention and timing for 22 years of dedicated service. His presence has become an integral part of my work routine, a reminder that some forms of professional dedication transcend the normal boundaries between employment and calling. New employees sometimes mention hearing footsteps in the basement during training periods, and I always explain that Harold is still helping ensure proper procedures are followed. His continued presence serves as both comfort and inspiration, demonstrating that the most dedicated professionals never really retire. They just find new ways to share their expertise and maintain standards they spent their careers developing. The basement at Eternal Rest operates with the efficiency and respect that Harold Voss established during his years of service. His 13-step pattern continues to time cremations appropriately. His attention to detail continues to guide proper procedures, and his understanding of cremation as sacred work continues to influence everyone who follows in his footsteps. Some rhythms become so deeply ingrained that death can't break the pattern. Harold's measured pacing through the basement storage area serves as a reminder that professional dedication can transcend physical limitations and that the most important work we do is characterized not by speed or efficiency, but by the careful attention we pay to each person entrusted to our care. The footsteps in the basement aren't a disturbance. They're a professional standard, maintained by someone who understood that crematory work requires both technical expertise and deep respect for the sacred nature of handling people's final earthly remains. Harold Voss continues to count steps, maintain timing, and ensure that every cremation meets the standards he spent his career developing. His rhythm has become part of the basement's permanent operating procedure, a steady beat that reminds everyone who works there that some responsibilities are too important to be abandoned, even by death. Sometimes the dead organize their own gatherings when the living forget to provide appropriate ceremony. I'm Janet Mills, Security Supervisor at Serenity Valley Memorial, responsible for monitoring our facility during overnight hours, when the building is closed to visitors, but still requires protection and oversight. It's quiet work that involves regular patrols, camera monitoring, and ensuring that our facility remains secure and respectful while families' loved ones rest in our care. But some nights, the building hosts gatherings I never scheduled and can't quite explain. Serenity Valley operates from a historic building that served our community since 1934, providing funeral services in an atmosphere of classical elegance and traditional comfort. The main chapel can accommodate large services with beautiful stained glass windows and wooden pews that have witnessed thousands of farewells over 9 decades of operation. The building's security system includes motion-activated lighting throughout the chapel and viewing rooms, designed to provide illumination when staff or authorized visitors enter areas after normal business hours. The lights are sensitive enough to detect small movements, but programmed to ignore settling sounds or minor air currents that might cause false activations. My overnight shift runs from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., Monday through Friday, with additional coverage during weekends when we host services. I make hourly rounds through the building, checking locks, monitoring alarm systems, and ensuring that everything remains secure and respectful for the families who trust us with their loved ones. But every few weeks, the chapel lights activate between 2 and 3 a.m. without any apparent cause. The first occurrence happened on a Tuesday night in late February. During my 2 a.m. rounds, I noticed light coming from beneath the chapel doors, not the soft emergency lighting that stays on continuously, but the full illumination used during services. When I entered the chapel to investigate, I found every light on and the pews arranged as if for a service. Not just arranged, prepared. Hymnals were open to specific pages, programs were placed neatly on seats throughout the chapel, and the guest book near the entrance was positioned exactly as it would be for a formal service. Someone had spent considerable time setting up the chapel for a ceremony, but no service was scheduled for that night. I checked the building thoroughly, looking for any sign of unauthorized entry or staff members working late. All doors remained locked, the alarm system showed no breaches, and security cameras revealed no movement in the building except my own patrol activities. But the chapel had been prepared for a service by hands I couldn't identify. The guest book was open to a fresh page, and when I examined it closely, I found signatures written in a flowing script that looked like 19th century penmanship. The names were difficult to read in the available light, but they appeared to be people signing attendance for some kind of gathering or ceremony. By morning, when I returned from my 6 a.m. concluding rounds, the chapel had returned to normal. Lights were off, hymnals were closed and properly positioned, and the guest book was closed with no trace of the signatures I'd seen during the night. Everything appeared exactly as it should for a building preparing for the next day's scheduled services. I documented the incident in my security log, noting the time and details while acknowledging that I had no explanation for what I'd observed. The building's security systems showed no malfunctions, and there was no evidence of any actual security breach. The second occurrence came 3 weeks later, following the same pattern. Chapel lights activated at 2:17 a.m., and when I investigated, I found the room prepared for a service with the same attention to detail. Hymnals open, programs placed, guest book positioned for signing. This time, I took photographs to document the scene before it could return to normal. The photographs showed something extraordinary. The chapel appeared to be filled with people, though I could see no one with my naked eyes. The images revealed translucent figures occupying pews throughout the room, men and women in clothing that spanned different historical periods, all maintaining the respectful posture of people attending a formal ceremony. In the center aisle, near the front of the chapel, stood a figure that seemed more solid than the others, an elderly man in a formal black suit, holding what appeared to be a Bible or prayer book, positioned as if conducting a service for the gathered congregation. The guest book signatures were clearer in the photographs, revealing names that dated back to the 1800s, people who had been buried from this chapel during its 9 decades of operation, apparently returning for some kind of reunion or memorial gathering. I researched the building's history, looking for any explanation for these mysterious nighttime services. Serenity Valley's records revealed that the chapel had hosted over 50,000 funerals since opening in 1934, serving as the spiritual center for our community through wars, epidemics, and generational changes. Many families had held multiple services in the chapel over the years, parents and children, grandparents and grandchildren, sometimes spanning 4 or 5 generations of the same family. The building had become a repository of shared grief and collective memory, a place where our community's most profound experiences of loss and love had been witnessed and honored. The mysterious services began occurring more frequently, usually during weeks when we'd hosted particularly moving or well-attended funerals. It was as if the emotional intensity of recent ceremonies was triggering gatherings of previous attendees, bringing together people who'd shared similar experiences of grief and farewell. I started observing the nighttime services from a respectful distance, recognizing them as legitimate gatherings that deserved the same privacy and reverence we provided for living families. The translucent congregation would maintain perfect silence, following the lead of the elderly man who seemed to serve as their spiritual guide. During one particularly clear manifestation, I was able to identify several of the attendees from historical photographs in our archives. They were people who'd been prominent in our community during different eras, returning to the chapel where their own funeral services had been conducted, or where they'd said goodbye to family members and friends. The services followed traditional patterns: opening hymns, though I heard no sound, readings from the Bible or poetry, moments of silent reflection, and closing ceremonies that seemed to provide comfort and connection to the gathered spirits. They were conducting their own memorial services, honoring their shared experiences of grief and their connections to this sacred space. One night in early May, I witnessed something that changed my understanding of what these gatherings represented. The chapel had been prepared for its usual mysterious service, but this time the translucent congregation included someone I recognized, Mrs. Eleanor Patterson, who'd been buried from our chapel just 2 weeks earlier. Mrs. Patterson sat in the front pew, surrounded by figures who seemed to be welcoming her into their eternal community. The elderly man conducting the service appeared to be introducing her to the other attendees, helping her understand her place in this gathering of souls who'd all shared the experience of being honored in this same chapel. I realized these weren't random supernatural occurrences. They were orientation services, helping newly deceased community members transition into whatever form of existence awaited them beyond physical death. The chapel continued to serve its purpose as a place of spiritual comfort and community connection, even for people whose earthly lives had ended. Mrs. Patterson's family had mentioned during her funeral that she'd been worried about being alone after death, fearful that her husband's earlier passing meant she'd face eternity in isolation. Seeing her welcomed into this eternal congregation provided reassurance that death didn't end community connections. It simply transformed them into something beyond normal understanding. The nighttime services continued throughout the spring and summer, occurring roughly every 2 to 3 weeks, with attendance that seemed to reflect recent funerals and community losses. Each gathering included a mix of long-dead community members and recent additions, all united by their shared connection to this chapel and their need for continued spiritual fellowship. I began leaving small comfort items in the chapel during nights when I expected these services: a pitcher of water, extra programs from recent funerals, candles that could provide gentle illumination for anyone who needed it. The items were always used respectfully and returned to their proper positions by morning. The elderly man who conducted these services gradually became more visible to me, as if my acceptance and respect for the gatherings allowed me to perceive him more clearly. He was Pastor Samuel Morrison, who'd served our community from 1934 to 1971, conducting over 15,000 funerals during his 37-year ministry at this chapel. Pastor Morrison had died in 1989, but his commitment to providing spiritual comfort and community connection had never ended. He continued to serve the congregation of souls who'd been honored in his chapel, ensuring that death didn't interrupt the spiritual fellowship they'd known in life. During one of our brief interactions, Pastor Morrison spoke to me directly for the first time. "Thank you for respecting our gatherings," he said in a voice that carried the gentle authority of decades spent comforting grieving families. "These services help our people understand that death is not an ending, but a transition into a different kind of community." "How long have you been conducting these services?" I asked. "Since the day after my own funeral," he replied with a slight smile. "I realized that my ministry wasn't finished just because my earthly life had ended. These people still needed spiritual guidance, still needed assurance that they weren't alone in whatever comes after death." The chapel's nighttime services provided comfort not just for the deceased participants, but for their living family members who sometimes sensed their loved one's presence during difficult nights. Several families mentioned feeling unexpectedly peaceful when visiting the chapel late at night, as if their deceased family members were somehow still connected to this place of farewell and memory. Our building manager, Mrs. Coleman, eventually became aware of the nighttime gatherings through my security reports. Instead of trying to prevent or investigate them, she made the decision to officially accommodate the services, recognizing them as a natural extension of the chapel's spiritual mission. "If Pastor Morrison is still providing comfort to people who need it, then we should support his ministry," she said practically. "These services don't interfere with our daytime operations, and they clearly serve a need that exists beyond our normal understanding." The chapel at Serenity Valley continues to host both scheduled services for living families and unscheduled gatherings for those who've moved beyond physical death. The building serves both communities with equal dedication, providing spiritual comfort and fellowship that transcends the normal boundaries between life and eternity. Sometimes I arrive early for my overnight shift and find evidence of recent supernatural activity: guest books signed with names from different centuries, programs arranged for services that never appeared on our official schedule, candles that burned without being lit by human hands. The building maintains its own spiritual calendar, serving needs that exist beyond normal business operations. The motion-activated lights in the chapel have become part of a larger spiritual illumination system, providing guidance for gatherings that exist in the space between memory and eternity. Pastor Morrison's continued ministry ensures that death doesn't end the human need for community, comfort, and spiritual fellowship. Sometimes, the dead organize their own gatherings when the living forget to provide appropriate ceremony. But in this chapel, the dead have never been forgotten, and their continued need for spiritual fellowship is honored by a pastor whose ministry transcended his own death, and a building that serves both earthly and eternal congregations with equal dedication. The unscheduled wakes remind me that some places become permanently sacred, serving spiritual needs that exist beyond the normal boundaries of time and mortality. Death doesn't end our need for community. It simply transforms our understanding of what community can include. The earth keeps secrets until someone with the right tools decides to uncover them. I'm Eddie Reeves, and I've been groundskeeper and gravedigger at Hillside Cemetery for 16 years. It's physical work that requires respect for the dead, attention to detail, and an understanding that every grave represents someone's final resting place and their family's sacred trust. You learn to read the land, to understand how soil shifts over time, and to recognize when something beneath the surface isn't quite where it should be. But some discoveries reveal secrets that were never meant to stay buried. Hillside Cemetery spans 43 acres of rolling hills that have served our community since 1879. The older sections near the entrance contain elaborate Victorian monuments and family mausoleums, while newer areas favor simpler markers that are easier to maintain. After 16 years working these grounds, I know every section, every family plot, and every quirk of the terrain that makes this cemetery unique. Grave preparation requires precision, exact measurements, proper depth, attention to drainage and soil composition. I use a combination of traditional tools and modern equipment, depending on the specific requirements of each burial. Metal detectors help me locate property markers and avoid underground utilities, while soil analysis ensures proper conditions for long-term stability. Plot 87 in Section D was designated for Mrs. Helen Morrison, who died at age 93 after a long life spent teaching elementary school in our community. Her family requested burial next to her husband Robert, who'd been interred in the adjacent plot 15 years earlier. It seemed like a straightforward preparation. Standard depth, good soil conditions, no complications expected. But when I began excavating Mrs. Morrison's grave on a Tuesday morning in early June, my shovel hit something that shouldn't have been there. 3 feet down, in earth that should have contained nothing but natural soil, I struck the corner of a wooden box. Not a casket or burial vault, something smaller, roughly the size of a storage chest, buried deliberately in ground that had never been designated for burial. I stopped digging and called our cemetery director, Mr. Franklin, who arrived within an hour to inspect the discovery. Together, we carefully excavated around the wooden box, revealing a handmade container that appeared to have been buried decades earlier. The wood was weathered but intact, preserved by the clay soil that dominated this section of the cemetery. Inside the box, we found dozens of funeral programs dating back 60 years, each one marked with a red X drawn across a different name. The programs represented services from various funeral homes throughout our county, spanning different decades and different families. But every person whose name was marked with a red X had one thing in common. They were all buried somewhere in Hillside Cemetery. More disturbing than the marked programs was what we found beneath them. Detailed notes written in the same hand, documenting the circumstances of each marked person's death. The notes revealed information that had never been made public, suspicious details about accidents that might not have been accidental, illnesses that progressed unusually rapidly, and family situations that suggested possible foul play. Mr. Franklin contacted the county sheriff's department, recognizing that we'd uncovered what appeared to be evidence of historical crimes. Detective Sarah Martinez arrived that afternoon with a team of investigators who documented everything meticulously before removing the box and its contents for detailed analysis. The investigation revealed something extraordinary and terrifying. Every person marked with a red X had died under circumstances that, upon closer examination, suggested possible murder. The notes in the box provided information that could only have been known by someone with intimate access to the deceased. Details about medications, family conflicts, financial situations, and opportunities for someone to cause death while making it appear natural. Detective Martinez shared what she could of the investigation findings. Whoever buried this box was documenting a series of murders spanning 40 years, she explained. The level of detail suggests someone with medical knowledge, access to victims, and the patience to wait for perfect opportunities. The handwriting analysis revealed that all the notes had been written by the same person, someone who'd methodically planned and executed dozens of murders while maintaining a position of trust that provided access to vulnerable victims. The red X marks weren't random. They were a killer's record of successful eliminations, documented with the pride of someone who believed they'd committed perfect crimes. But the most chilling discovery came when forensic experts analyzed the most recent entries in the box. The notes extended through 2018, suggesting that whoever had created this murderous archive might still be alive and potentially still active. The final entry was different from the others. Instead of documenting a completed murder, it appeared to be a confession, written in the same careful handwriting that had documented 60 years of killings. The note read, "I can no longer carry this burden alone. The dead deserve justice, and the living deserve to know the truth. I buried these records where they would eventually be found, in ground dedicated to those I wronged." The confession was signed Dr. Margaret Chen, a name that sent shockwaves through our community. Dr. Chen had been our county's most respected physician for over 50 years, serving as family doctor to thousands of residents and providing compassionate care through multiple generations. She died in 2019 at age 87, mourned by a community that had trusted her with their most precious lives. The investigation revealed that Dr. Chen had used her position as a trusted physician to systematically murder patients who met certain criteria: elderly people with substantial inheritances, abusive spouses or parents, individuals she deemed threats to family harmony. She'd perfected methods that mimicked natural death, using her medical knowledge to end lives while maintaining her reputation as a caring healer. Her confession explained the motivation behind decades of killing. "I believed I was protecting families from toxic influences, helping inheritances reach deserving recipients, ending suffering that seemed pointless. But I realize now that I became the very evil I thought I was eliminating." The buried box represented Dr. Chen's attempt at posthumous justice, ensuring that her crimes would eventually be discovered and investigated. She'd chosen to hide the evidence in Hillside Cemetery because she knew that eventually routine grave preparation would uncover the truth. The discovery led to the exhumation and re-examination of dozens of bodies, confirming that many deaths attributed to natural causes had actually been carefully orchestrated murders. Families received closure about suspicious circumstances they'd questioned for years, though the revelation that their trusted family doctor had been a serial killer created new forms of trauma and grief. Mrs. Morrison's burial proceeded as scheduled, but her gravesite became part of a larger investigation that transformed our understanding of our community's history. The cemetery that had seemed like a peaceful resting place for natural deaths was revealed to contain the victims of one person's twisted concept of mercy and justice. I continued my work as groundskeeper, but with a new awareness of the secrets that might be buried beneath seemingly ordinary ground. Every grave preparation now carried the possibility of uncovering evidence of historical crimes, family secrets, or individual stories that had been deliberately hidden from public knowledge. The wooden box had been buried specifically where grave preparation would eventually find it, suggesting that Dr. Chen had calculated not just the timing of her murders, but the timing of her confession. She'd chosen to let the earth reveal her secrets when the community was ready to handle the truth. Hillside Cemetery remains a place of peace and reflection, but it also serves as a reminder that some secrets are too terrible to stay buried forever. Dr. Chen's confession ensured that her victims received belated justice and that future potential victims were protected from anyone who might follow her twisted example. The investigation concluded with the identification of 63 murder victims whose deaths had been attributed to natural causes over 4 decades. Dr. Chen's systematic documentation provided closure for families, while revealing the horrifying reality that their most trusted medical professional had been their community's most dangerous predator. Plot 87 in Section D now holds Mrs. Morrison's peaceful remains, but it also marks the spot where truth finally emerged from decades of careful burial. The earth keeps secrets until someone with the right tools decides to uncover them. And sometimes those discoveries change everything we thought we knew about the people we trusted most. Some secrets are meant to stay buried, but others are meant to be found when the time is right for justice, closure, and the protection of future victims. Dr. Chen's varied confession reminded our community that evil can hide behind the most trusted faces, and that the dead sometimes find ways to protect the living from dangers they never recognized.